So
Oh, and then
go back to the meeting.
it's not
Have you thought through where you're thinking of applying already?
So
priority is
camera
likely going to be
is
Okay.
what you
because I
see.
do- I'm not
If you
interested
don't change
as of this moment in a
the three
PhD.
camera angles,
okay.
So
that's
I just don't want to quit philosophy after as interested in it as I am.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I have the dedication to do
right and
PhD route.
where camera.
Um,
So whatever
I think you're
camera
wise
you
to,
want, I know
in that
how
case, to
persons
do an MA
use
first and
camera
see how you
just
feel.
to
Exactly, and if I get convinced in the MA, then
It all depends.
You were in the MA
Some
program.
use this view,
Yeah.
Right.
whatever works for you. Currently, one.
so I think Western's a priority.
Front right,
I can save
that.
more money.
Yeah.
Let's see.
then there's front left.
Well, as we said at the meeting, there's
But
Canada has lots of
research
very good
MA
MA
first.
Yeah. And I've been looking, I asked Professor Tyke as well, and he gave some recommendations that I didn't do as well.
Okay, great.
There's some are 2-year programs, which is not as interesting to me.
Yeah, the problem with a one-year program,
Includes views.
is if you are thinking of doing a PhD, is that you're only just starting your first year when you will be submitting your applications. Are you planning on applying for a PhD later, or do
And so the audio from that will come through
you know where?
these speakers.
Yeah, once, whatever the.
I'm not decided.
You haven't decided yet?
I know it is very difficult, so I will not say I have choose some programs because it's they that choose me.
And are you thinking you'll stay in North America for the PhD or go back to,
Yeah.
are you from China?
Yeah,
Yeah.
actually, I'm currently in a joint
Or are you doing the
so I will
Fudan?
Renmin University.
Okay,
So I will go back to Renmin University.
So
to
another
get
thing
my
I need to show you is the.
yeah, so there's this program that Western co-hosts with a couple of universities in China, where a student can do 2 simultaneous MAs, one in China and one here.
This is important program volume for the person. You can either.
So, but for your PhD, are you gonna stay in China? You'll go back to North America?
Maybe, but you don't include it too much because someone else is starting from here. You know, crosstalk, you don't want to have all that. Then for the.
And what other classes are you taking this term?
This is the more control for the mic.
Besides philosophy of
You can also.
language, I also take a seminar and Humanities.
Okay.
Professor Hughes Humanities.
And do you know what your area of specialization is going to be?
Contemporary acting.
Oh, okay.
But I think I'm also somewhat interested in history of.
Well, I hope you get to do some ethics next term.
It's an international summit.
We thought the classrooms might be a little bit small.
Yeah.
They're not nearly as imposing enough.
I think you're being rung up on charges, Lauren. Lauren, you have to go that way, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm ready.
I think Lauren needs to be sitting at the head of the table.
Oh, look.
Podium. Oh, Lauren needs, I guess they want you at the podium.
Yeah,
the head.
Yeah.
Everything getting set up okay?
Oh, yeah.
Good.
And then we pair off.
I think this is the head of the table.
Okay.
All right. Someone asks which room we're in.
3000
but
WIRB.
what's the building called?
WIRB.
Well, I guess you're getting some history in the
Western
Cavendish course. and-
Interdisciplinary research.
Disciplinary research building.
Yep.
Um. Here. One of us.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
This is the head of the table.
To be honest, having a semester without any aspect of courses.
Uh-huh.
Do you need any help on getting that hooked up?
There's nothing
See, just a second.
in ethics?
Uh, Actually, there is research that.
You didn't want to do that?
Whatever.
I think now I'm not that interested.
A bottle of water.
Very well, how are you?
I like that this is being called Warren Fest.
Yeah.
It's nice. Yes.
All right, ready?
I'm ready, yeah. Yeah, it's set to duplicate.
The mistake,
Right.
Duplicate.
not to choose.
You're on the screen.
Research.
Oh, there we are. Okay, perfect.
It is the ethics.
It's a bottle of water. I don't know how long you wanted to speak for.
Well, I'll try and keep.
Oh, right, if he wants to share a screen.
That's about what I estimated.
I thought I'd keep it as short as possible.
And I told the critics about 10 minutes. And then you can have whatever time you want to respond and
Sounds good.
say what you want, and then we'll open it up to
Sounds good.
the room.
Lauren, you need to join the Zoom meeting as well, so you can share your screen on the Zoom.
Okay. I'll look up that address and go in there.
Well, you've been doing very well in the philosophy of language class, even though not very yet.
We better call it.
You should be more confident. Doing well in my class as well. And your English is perfectly fine.
That's not true.
Get back to the Zoom.
Well, I know what is true is that your English is better than my Chinese. Right, Jack?
Oh, so I can't, so I
You've
can't.
not heard me speak Chinese before, but you know that, just.
I don't send. Yeah. Because if you send it, it will cost cents. Okay.
I should be able to.
Did you send it? I can.
Should be able to. So I think to project slides, you just gotta hook up and join the Zoom. So that the people on Zoom can see the slides.
Oh, good, okay.
So Lauren is doing that now. But when we transition, we should be able to hook you up in just a couple minutes.
I think it might be worthwhile. I didn't get my hands together alert in time to print it.
Okay.
So I used some slides.
I think
You should also don't hesitate to share your personal statement with me, and I can give you some feedback on it if you want. Before you apply.
Thank you very much. You will be happy.
Because it's something, as I was saying to Jack, I had never done it either when I was an undergrad, and it was a kind of writing I had no familiarity with, right? I had no idea what was really wanted, so.
with what?
The personal statement for grad school.
Oh, yeah. That thing's horrible.
Oh, mine was crazy. It's astonishing that I was admitted anywhere. It was
I still don't think I have any idea how to do one of those things.
I did so many drafts. I had an extremely patient mentor at my undergrad institution who kept giving me feedback. And
Okay.
Once you reset system, it's on
I
a.
think eventually it's
Of course you have
I
to.
just had no clue where to start. I'm Rob Stanton. by the way.
Yeah, seems like everything.
Where are you coming to us from?
Too many different computers.
Oh,
Right.
good. Welcome.
thank you.
So I was a resident expert in
Latest
philosophy of language.
Edition of Chrome now gives you
Versus philosophy of mind.
news pop-ups.
Linguistics.
Yeah, oh,
So I think
Yeah,
I'm a resident expert in linguistics.
yeah, I gotta figure out how to do that.
2 resident experts.
And then I enjoy history of philosophy, but I'm not a historian, so that's why I'm.
And you love Lauren.
And I love lawyer. Well, I've been pals for some 2 decades now, so.
Everybody loves Lauren.
Except me.
Except for you.
So where is the camera? Is it gonna be trained on my screen if I'm checking email?
Right now we're using this camera.
Okay. I taught in a classroom that's cutting edge with all the cameras and microphones and didn't realize that the mic was connecting to the
I have
atrium.
to check my email.
Thanks.
Oh, really? Really? I thought I had all that, thought I had the building and everything. My bad, I'm sorry.
You know, it could be, I just see it.
Okay, but you made it, that's all that matters.
Yeah.
We're borrowing this space. This is not native philosophical. You can have it now. And,
So get yourself
do that for
a
later.
cookie or pastry. Jack,
There, who needs it? You guys need to get some cookies, right? You guys miss luck, so. You know. I don't believe we've met.
No,
I'm Ben.
Austin.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you as well.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm my first year, PhD student.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Yeah, me too as well.
I'm looking forward to hearing more talk.
I know, me too.
So what do you
I went.
Cross paths before,
So
but
you would you like to join us for dinner tonight? For dinner?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I would love that.
Nice to have you here.
I think after the session, we'll head to the grad club. And then we've got reservations for 7, so if you just follow the crowd.
Very good. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm excited. It was awesome. I was happy.
Okay.
Was supposed to happen earlier than was scheduled, or was like, am I just misremembering something?
I don't recall that, but Ben would know better.
I remember you mentioned something about that.
You set me up so I could share.
Was this gonna happen earlier and then?
I think it was gonna happen
Getting to,
earlier. I think it
talk
was
about
going
the
to
book
be
and
bigger.
Yeah.
So a 2-day event instead of.
Oh man, this is like one of those mirrors that face
Because
itself,
I think
like an infinite number of Lorns.
Ben applied for a large federal level grant. Trying to bring in more people.
Right.
Yeah, unfortunately, my grant writing was not adequate enough to foster. Right back.
Johnny and I organized something on Lady Mary Shepherd in May or June.
Oh, nice.
And we didn't, this past summer, and we didn't get funding either, so.
Not only did we not get funding, they put us in the lowest tier of applications. You remember that? I was.
For Lady Mary Shepherd.
Yeah,
That's too bad.
I was pretty surprised by that. Yeah, I thought that. I don't know, I thought they might.
Just that topic should have piqued up some interest.
Yeah.
How are you? When was early 1910. Part of the new narratives, everyone's meeting new people and she's on the list for sure. Particularly on the sort of the British Empirical Society, because she's engaging with Hume a lot.
Okay. To Barclay.
Mhm.
Yes.
So how do I get the junk at the top that disappeared?
A problem concerning with, wait. Oh, that jump. Click.
Yes.
Well, you need to turn your video on.
Okay.
It's on, he's at the top.
And you need to share your screen.
Okay.
Well, the relationship between being an Englishman and bravery is not what is said.
It's, according to Grace, it's not part of what is said, that's right.
Yeah, but I just can't.
And that's very controversial. So lots of people disagree with that. It should be.
So are we all using
Philosopher Kant.
computer or do we each need to?
So if you want to share like a slide on the screen, you need to plug your computer in.
Okay.
Have the HDMI cord there. But if you don't want to, then you don't.
And
If you don't want to share a slide
things
on
that
the
in a
board,
situation like
then you don't need your computer there.
Okay, but in terms of,
he was.
so I do want to share and I have an HDMI port, all that good
So
stuff.
if you want to share, you need to log into the Zoom and then share your screen on the Zoom. And then you need to plug your computer to the HDMI port.
Call the Hume's remedy and that they didn't like you or something.
Narrow.
I'm sort of reading between the lines, and that's what it seems to suggest.
Do you mind stopping the meeting?
Yes. Well, they said it.
Yeah.
An issue with searches.
Need my email address?
Just what.
I should be able to just send it
The
to
opposite.
the
Like, very happy when I didn't
your
have a subtitle. They were
email.
like, yeah, short and punchy, that's good.
Yeah,
To eat?
yeah, but,
There's snacks over there if you want something to eat and a coffee or something to help yourself.
This doesn't exactly roll off the tongue though, and Hume's remedy is such a.
First paragraph of the introduction by It's there.
Oh, let's the,
Many things that you were
Right, it's not that you're misunderstanding, it's that those, it's very hard to tease apart.
Three levels.
Need to use the microphones or?
And so to talk onto the.
It's just to push the button and then unpress it when you're to mute.
Yeah.
What he has in mind is how you would translate the content
So
to
at least they let me have headers, page headers.
a logical language of the sort that Frege and Russell had developed, right? And so if you think about,
And I think the navigation in the PDF is much better.
therefore, there's no way of representing that in a proposition.
There's so many cross references to sections.
In the paragraph.
I read these days.
Connected, but, right? There's just.
Great book.
Thank you.
I haven't finished it all, but I must say, it's, yeah, despite your, my being in the line of fire on occasion.
With the ampersand.
No, it's just disagreements.
Symbolic logic. So that's what, as far as he's concerned, that's all. So it's because
I tried to find in my email an exchange we had, well, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 15 years ago. And I think I was using a different email address.
almost a
Perceptions and related to that consciousness. Yeah, and it's, I'll bring it up in my comments.
Good. Yeah, it's the sort of thing that's in the back of my mind. And that's a weakness. Yeah.
So.
It seems to me that you're being pulled in two directions in what I've read. So
This little.
here, which is your considered?
Preamble.
You avoid the problems of the other one.
And then he.
Let's see.
True book. You sort of some things like your stuff on consciousness and temporality was amazing.
Manifestational principle.
Have you, my student Shelley Weinberg, she has a paper on consciousness and Locke,
Yes.
which sees consciousness kind of temporally spread out for Locke.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I did not- I should look at it.
Is
Actually, there's a book that sort of develops it as
theory.
well, but there's a paper called, I don't know, the metaphysical fact of consciousness or something in Locke. And there's to understand the personal identity section, you have to see consciousness in a certain way.
Consciousness is straight up.
Yeah, so that's
I
what,
find that very confusing.
yeah.
On the condition.
Yes.
Let's say.
Have the same meaning as what you find in logical language.
In a sense, like you look at the way he added the personal identity section, it could be that that's, you know, there are all these tensions in his views and he kind of resolves them in a certain way.
My last full year.
Ends up explicating this notion of consciousness in the personal identity section that's kind of implicit in the earlier stuff, not very well articulated, so that kind of fits. Your story.
No, that's the thing. I was just. During the pandemic, I really thought about what's been.
Lauren, you want to use the podium microphone or do you want a handheld microphone?
No, please, please help yourself.
We'll never go there.
I can believe
It's scary.
kind of American.
Yeah, it really does. Yeah, I mean,
I hope everyone's finding their way to the coffee and the drinks and snacks. So please help yourself.
about what level of policy making is.
Yeah, it's like part of Toronto that felt like there are parts of Toronto where people are down, man, like Sherburne and Gerrard.
Yeah.
Like just walking to the train station this morning. That's hell.
Yeah.
Kind of walking in the water, cars come along and off.
For people to arrive.
All you matter is say she's a stupid bitch.
I'm gonna get started in the range.
And then I go to the coffee shop for a while. The hotel room won't be ready. Somebody comes in and runs the coffee shop. Very. It's it's like.
I'm not too.
Yeah, well, you can't be here.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. It's 1:30, so we'd like to get started now. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased that we have our very own Lauren Falkenstein here to talk about his recent book and to share some of his long thinking about Hume and Hume's use of skepticism in particular. But also along the way, there's going to be discussion of Hume on consciousness and perception, Hume's account of time and space, and Hume's account of bodies. So I'm really looking forward to this. I'm very pleased that we have some invited people to discuss Lauren's book with us today as well. We have Johnny Cottrell, who's here in the room with us to provide comments and questions. And Donald Ainslie is here as well in the room with us to also provide comments and criticisms. And then online, we have Wade Robinson, who's going to be providing some comments and criticisms. And Alexander Keith is here as well. Or sorry, Alexander Klein is here as well online to provide some commentary. So thanks everyone for joining us. Lauren will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll start circling through the invited critics for about, people will get about 10 minutes or 12 minutes to talk, and then Lauren will respond. We have a keynote address from Anne-Marie Butler, who is joining us here from Iowa State. So we're very pleased to have Anne-Marie here. And I hope you enjoy today. So thank you. Ron.
Thank you all for coming. It's great to see you here. A big thanks, Ben, for what must have been a huge amount of work putting all of this together. You've done a great job with this. Thank you so much. And thanks, Anne-Marie, and Donald, Johnny, for taking trouble to come here today and expose my more grievous faults and errors. Thank you so much. Okay. If I can get the junk to disappear, there we go. Hume's remedy, well, The book is called Consciousness, Time, and Scepticism in Hume's Thought. But I'm going to refer to it as Hume's Remedy rather than try and mouth that long title. Hume's Remedy takes off from a problem that Hume encountered concerning wisdom. He wrote, "A wise person, therefore, proportions their belief to the evidence." But he also wrote that belief is the necessary result of placing the mind in such circumstances.
The audio turned off?
No, audio is on.
The audio should be on. Yeah. I can hear it.
Maybe your speakers mute.
Belief is the necessary result of placing the mind in such circumstances. It is an operation of the soul when we are so situated, as unavoidable as to feel the passion of love when we receive benefits or hatred when we meet with injuries. All these operations are a species of natural instincts, which no reasoning or process of the thought and understanding is able to produce or to prevent. Now, there's no conflict between those two passages. They jointly entail that, given that the wise proportion their belief to the evidence, there must be something about their circumstances that determines them to do so. Since not everyone is wise, those circumstances would have to be special to them. And that's the problem. That's where the problem arises.
Lauren, can you move your cursor up to the view people in the waiting room there? I think that's you. And hit view, not X. Hit view. There you go. And then hit admit all, the top right of that little box.
Okay.
And I was afraid that just click on your PowerPoint again and you're good to go. Don't click anything like that. Yep, just go click on the white area outside of that box. Okay. And or maybe you have to close that box. You have to hit.
I guess I gotta close that box.
Sorry, we're having some Zoom trouble, but.
There's the X.
Yes, you are.
Okay.
This is Wade, and I'm on my phone, which means I can't see a damn thing.
Oh, okay.
The only way I could get in.
Can you get?
Okay, Wade, if you want to follow, I'm going to give you an address.
Okay.
Philpapers.org.
Excuse me. Start over again. You're a little blurred. Say again, please.
Phil Papers. Or can somebody
Phil
send
Papers.
email? Can
Phil
somebody
Papers.
Email?
Well, I'll give it to you anyway. Phil Papers, one word, PHILPAPERS.org/GO period PL question mark AID
DO? No, GO dot DO?
dot PL
I haven't started it yet.
question mark AID equal sign, and then all caps, if that matters, FALAPO.
APO?
FALAPO.
Alato? ATO. All in caps.
All in caps, yeah.
Okay, I think I got it. We'll see what happens.
That should be a text for the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, I can.
All right.
I'm online now. And I can get everybody. I've got the Zoom under control, guys. I'll take care of it from here.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry about that. Just a little hiccup. And Wade, I will send you an email.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks for joining, Wade.
Excuse me?
Thanks for joining.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
Okay. So that's the problem. Not everyone is wise, and even wise people are not always wise. There are factors that prevent our beliefs from being determined just by the evidence. And Hume was sensitive to these facts. He did more than
Lauren, I believe you're muted.
All right.
Maybe you don't want to be.
And I'll, sorry, we're really not doing well here.
Every time he.
The host would like. I'm
There,
the one.
see, now it's-
No, he should be
There,
muted. I'm
now
the
it's
one who
fine.
no, he should be muted. I'm the one who should be unmuted.
All right, do you want to just start at the top?
Okay, we'll start again.
We'll start again.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Okay, all right, I think we got it.
Got it?
I just got to send Wade an email.
Sounds good. Okay. So consciousness, time, and skepticism, which I'm going to refer to as Hume's remedy, takes off from a problem Hume encountered concerning wisdom. That problem arises from some things Hume said about wisdom. He said, a wise person, therefore, proportions their belief to the evidence. But he also said that belief is the necessary result of placing the mind in such circumstances. An operation of the soul is unavoidable as to feel the passion of love when we receive benefits, or hatred when we meet with injuries. All these operations are a species of natural instincts, which no reasoning or process of thought and understanding is able to either produce or prevent. Now, there's no conflict between these passages. They jointly entail that given that the wise proportion their belief to the evidence, there must be something about their circumstances that determines them to do so. Since not everyone is wise, those circumstances must be special to them. And that's what the problem is. Not everyone is wise. Even wise people are not always wise. There are factors that prevent our beliefs from being determined just by the evidence. And Hume was sensitive to these facts. He did more than almost anyone else at the time to catalog extra empirical influences on belief and explain how and why they determine our beliefs. Realizing these things, Hume was determined himself by his circumstances to consider whether there's something that might more effectively determine us to proportion our beliefs to the evidence. He maintained that being impressed by the force of skeptical arguments is one such determinant. The topics that are taken up in Hume's remedy arise in connection with his effort to advance and apply that remedy. The remedial skeptical argument to which Hume devoted the most attention denies that we've got good reason for accepting that we experience an external world. This argument invokes a distinction between what's external and what's internal, what exists independently and what's dependent. But internal to what? Dependent on what? Not for Hume, a mind. As those of us who know Hume know all too well, the Hume of the treatise famously claimed to be unable to understand what minds are beyond bundles of perceptions. Hume's remedy argues that external and independent refers to what lies beyond the visual and tactile sensory fields. In developing this position, Hume's remedy studies how Hume understood the relation between conscious states, which for Hume are sense impressions, ideas, passions, the relation between those conscious states and our experience of space and time. Now, this is a topic that was not at all esoteric at the time. Many people were worried about this. What is the relation between mental states and space and time, or conscious states than space and time. At the time, there were thought had sort of coalesced around two alternative theories. We might describe one as nativism or conceptualism. Its point of view advocated by people like Descartes, Malebranche, and Reid. According to that point of view, the mind is an unextended spiritual substance. Therefore, none of its sensory states, things like pain, pleasure, tastes, smells, color, you can read the note yourself on color that's there. None of those are located in space. For Descartes and Malebranche, our beliefs that pains occur in personal body parts and that colors are extended over a visual field are juvenile preconceptions or natural but mistaken judgments. For Reid, we're innately so constituted that under appropriate stimulus conditions, we perform acts of conceiving external objects. So what's spatially extended is the external object. The acts that we perform, being states of a mind, they're nothing like the objects conceived. In particular, they're not located in space. It's the objects of the acts, the external objects that are in space. Reid further maintained that none of our sensory states is anything like any of the qualities of objects. No one, not even the vulgar, thinks that any of the qualities of their sensory states exists anywhere in space. Idiosyncratically, Reid further maintained that no one, not even painters, interior decorators, florists, cosmeticians, gardeners, and so on, ever uses the word color or the color terms of any language to refer to the qualities of their visual sensations. For Reid, color terminology is only ever used to refer to what's invisible, the microstructure of visible objects that causes visuals, nameless visual sensations, not described or named in any language that we have. That's Reid's position. So that's one position. The second classic position might be called empirism. I draw a distinction between empiricism, which is an epistemological theory, and empirism, which is a position in perceptual psychology. The empirists share many things in common with the nativists. If we flip back and forth, the mind is an unextended spiritual substance for both of them. None of its sensory states, well, the nativists I just abbreviated are located in space. The empirists just qualify that slightly. None of its sensory states are immediately perceived as located in space. We learn to associate purely qualitative and temporal features of visual and tactile sensations with the locations occupied by objects in ambient space. Now, that empirist project was only partially executed by Berkeley. He never managed to account for localization of sensations on the two-dimensional visual field, of visual sensations, for instance. Later, people writing in the Berkeleyan tradition, like Robert Smith and Condillac, attempted more, but with questionable success. Hume had a novel position, and Kant, following him later, had that essentially the same position. Rather than start off by saying the mind is an unextended spiritual substance, none of its states can therefore be extended, Hume took space to be a manner in which simple visual and tactile sensations are disposed in complex visual and tactile impressions. Kant similarly took space to be a form of intuition and sensations to be the matter. Too bad if that doesn't fit with the supposition that the mind is an unextended spiritual substance. On time, there wasn't the same dispute. Everyone in the 18th century was a presentist. That is, someone who thinks that perceptual consciousness is confined to what exists at the present moment, and that what existed prior to the present can only be known by memory. Early modern accounts of memory were uniformly disastrous, except for Reid's, which is invested in the contentious tenet that we can conceive non-existent objects. So for Reid, we do not conceive a currently existing memory or representation of the past. We conceive the very past object, even though it no longer exists. Hume's remedy argues that Hume and also Locke couldn't account for the experience of succession without tacitly abandoning that presentist account, and instead relying on the notion that consciousness extends some way into the very recent past, that we're somehow able to, as I think they both used this phrase, take notice of what has just passed, as if we could still see it standing there where it was or is off in the past, just as we can see what is standing off to the left as off to the left. So that's one conclusion that I argue for in Hume's remedy. A more general version of that conclusion is that Hume was not a psychological atavist. He didn't think that simple sensory experiences exist except in rare and mostly, I think the word is pathological circumstances where consciousness is artificially confined. So originally given perceptual consciousness is complex. It's divisible into simple parts, but it's rarely ever divided into those parts. Sensory consciousness typically extends over an entire field of spatially disposed colored points and an entire field of spatially disposed tactile points, the latter being normally thought of as our own bodies. These fields are not just aggregates of sensible quality points, they're sensible quality points disposed in a certain fashion. The manner of disposition of visible and tactile points is a further feature of complex sense impressions. It's present in complex sense impressions as they originally exist. That's where the intuitionism comes in. It's not the best word to use in connection with Hume because Hume used it in a different sense, but taking intuition as immediate awareness. It's present in complex impressions as they originally exist prior to any operations of the imagination or understanding. It's also not reducible to or derivable from anything found in the disposed colored and tactile points. To exist at all, it must exist as a feature of an originally given. Visual and tactile sensory experience, visual and tactile consciousness takes up space. And consciousness of all sorts is also temporally extended in the sense of extending into the very recent past. So that's one issue, one big issue, and one big set of conclusions. There's a second that I'll highlight today. There's a further, and it arises out of a further problem with Hume's arguments for external world skepticism. That's his cavalier approach to the distinction between sense impressions or images presented to the senses and publicly observable objects. By sense impressions, I mean things like pleasures, pains, tastes, smells, colors. Read that earlier footnote in connection with how I'm using the word color. Publicly observable objects, on the other hand, are things like billiard balls, apples, tables, hats, shoes, stones. In both the treatise and the enquiry, Hume began his investigations into the workings of the mind by talking about sense impressions. But whenever the subject turned to relations, most notably causal relations, he dropped references to impressions in favor of references to publicly observable objects. takes some work to account for how a field of spatially and temporally disposed colored or tactile points takes on the character of an image of an apple or table. It then takes more work to identify such images, which are private and temporary and perspective dependent, with multifaceted, enduring mobile objects that change in regular ways over time. Hume never did that work. Hume's famous account of causal inference focuses on regularity in the succession of species, paradigmatically species of external objects, simply assuming that these objects are as directly perceived as perceptions of pain or anger. When talking about external world skepticism, he claimed that ordinary people take their very sense impressions, or in the inquiry, the images presented by the senses, to be external objects, ignoring that ordinary people take things like hats, shoes, and stones to be external objects, and that one cannot simply be identified with the other. I'm not new in saying this, lots of people have said this, and it's the basis of a classic Kantian objection. Some of the most frequently cited sources are H.H. Price, Louis Whitebeck, objecting that Kant took the achievement of recognizing objects for granted. Among Hume scholars, I think David Pears makes a lot of this. That Hume took the achievement of recognizing objects for granted, neglecting the role of Pears did not have that further part, but Beck and Hume did, neglecting the role of a priori concepts in this operation. Hume's remedy is concerned with how Hume could have dealt with this. Hume famously made it a principle never to reply to his critics. He very quickly became disgusted with the treatise and never attempted to revise it. But it's an interesting question. What could he have done with the resources at his disposal to deal with this question? So not what we can do today, but what could he have done at the time to deal with this? Hume's remedy is concerned with that question. And it draws on Humean resources, principally association by contiguity and resemblance, to formulate Humean positions on how we come to orient ourselves in space, parse the sensory fields into images presented by the senses, and ascribe identity over time to these images, even across gaps in observation. With these resources, Hume could have provided an account of how impressions and images presented by the senses are immediately perceived as publicly observable objects without needing to appeal to a priori concepts. But this answer comes at a cost. It calls for a more robust account of temporal experience and spatial representation than Hume provided. The Hume of the treatise maintained that nothing unchangeable can ever be said to have duration. This doctrine frustrated his ability to offer an adequate account of identity over time. This is a claim that Hume's remedy makes. He was also himself unable to abide by it. This is a passage, we were talking at lunch about general rules and rules by which to judge of causes and effects. Here's a passage from Rules by which to judge of causes and effects. An object which exists for any time in its full perfection without any effect is not the sole cause of that effect, but requires to be assisted by some other principle which may forward its influence and operation. How can you think that and at the same time think that nothing unchangeable can ever be thought to have duration? Then there's no point to a rule directing you to search for hidden activators. Such a rule could have no purpose because nothing ever really lasts. So Hume himself could not abide by this. If he really thought that it was just a fiction, that things seem to, why do you have a rule directing you what to do in fictional circumstances? Hume's remedy argues that the non-endurance doctrine is not justified by any of the reasons Hume offered in its support. or by reasons commentators have so far been able to come up with on his behalf. And that this is all to the good because Hume's failure in this regard preserves the integrity of his views on more important matters. The Hume of the treatise also maintained that we can form no idea of a vacuum or space. This is one of his two definitions of vacuum, space where there is nothing visible or tangible. This doctrine frustrated his ability to recognize abiding visual and tactile field boundaries and their role in spatial orientation. Again, there's a kind of tension in Hume's own thought. One can't coherently write that the eye at all times sees an equal number of physical points, while maintaining that when two bodies present themselves where there was formerly an entire darkness, the only change that is discoverable is in the appearance of these two objects, and that the surrounding darkness or negation of light causes no perception different from what a blind person receives and affords us no idea of extension. In that case, your visual field is going to be just shrinking and expanding with lighting conditions. To justify his position, Hume attempted to do for the experience of vacuum what Berkeley had done for the experience of visual depth. Berkeley had argued that we do not immediately perceive visual depth, distance outwards from us. We only learn to infer tangible distances from qualitative cues in visual experience, cues like eye muscle sensations. We come to read or immediately perceive these cues in visual experience as signs for tangible distance, outward tangible distance. Hume tried to run much the same argument as Hume's remedy claims. He claimed we do not immediately perceive empty spaces between lone visible bodies, like two stars appearing in the sky, Venus and the pole star, no space between them. There are no empty spaces between lone visible bodies. We only learn to infer the existence of spaces filled with colored points between the lone bodies from qualitative cues like eye and hand muscle sensations. Because we think that the filled intervals are there, but we don't see anything between the lone bodies, we falsely imagine, as Hume at one point put it, that the lone bodies are separated by a distance we can't see, an invisible and intangible distance. That is, we falsely imagine we're perceiving a vacuum when we're really only perceiving the two lone bodies and being impelled by association to think of this filled distance at the same time. So that's Hume's line of argument. Now, I don't think it works. It's one thing to offer an associationist account of visual depth perception. It's already much more difficult to offer an associationist account of localization on the two-dimensional visual field. It's similarly difficult to offer an associationist account of the false imagining of a vacuum. If all that exists visually are two luminous bodies, the notion of moving an eye from one to the other makes no sense. We think of moving the eyes as involving bringing first one object and then the other to the center of the field of view. But as Hume describes it, in the lone body case, there's nothing but the two lone bodies. There's no field of view that has a center. The two lone bodies are supposed to be all that appear, and they appear, according to Hume, without any space being perceived around or between them. So what can it mean to move the eyes from one to the other? You just move your eyes and still keep seeing the two lone bodies. Or maybe if you move them far enough, one of them would disappear or both of them would disappear. But there would be many motions that have that effect of causing one or both of them to disappear. So associating the appearance of the lone bodies with any particular eye motion from the one to the other appears to be impossible. Plausibly, Hume was so deeply committed to the background view that whatever we see always appears at a location on the visual field that he didn't notice he was appealing to it. He failed to notice he had it and was using it. Hume's remedy argues that this is the case with all the distance cues. He mentions a number of distance cues. Hume's remedy goes through them one by one and argues it echoes a criticism that Reid made of Hume's account of memory. Reid charged that Hume could only account for memory, the kind of memory he thought existed, namely a more vivacious idea, by invoking the kind of memory he wanted to deny. And this is the same sort of point, that he ends up tacitly relying on the very picture he means to deny. In attempting to make his, now I think that's fortunate, once again, it's a good thing that he failed. In attempting to make his case against the perception of a vacuum, Hume maintained that it's possible for two colored points to appear without appearing as disposed in space. In doing so, he allowed that we can have color sensations that are nowhere in space. Reid never picked up on that. But it's an admission that, were it valid, would have legitimated Reid's view that color sensations are not in space. They are states of an unextended spiritual substance. It would also have lent credence to the radical empirist position that we learned to associate originally aspatial color sensations with locations in space. It's fortunate that Hume's case against the perception of a vacuum collapses. It's even more telling that his failure was due to the fact that it's so difficult to conceive lone bodies without conceiving them to be disposed in space, that even when Hume thought he'd succeeded in showing that to be the case, he hadn't. In conclusion, Hume's positions on endurance without change and the conceivability of a vacuum are a betrayal of his account of time and space as manners of disposition. That account marks the first articulation of an intuitionist account of temporal experience and spatial representation. It recognizes temporal and spatial fields as originally perceived, independently real entities. It is more plausible than its rival nativist and empirist theories, and was later recognized in his own way by Kant. Having gone so far as to recognize the spatiality of visual and tactile sensory states, Hume turned his back on it. Treating space and time as if they had no independent reality, neglecting the importance of association by contiguity in space and contiguity in space over time, that's identity, denying that it is possible to perceive or conceive a vacuum, and maintaining that temporal passage cannot be experienced in the absence of change. Hume's remedy argues that he was wrong to say what he did about endurance and vacuum, and shows how he could have developed robust accounts of identity and objectivity had he corrected the oversights and errors that led him to neglect the further development of one of his best ideas. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Lauren. That was nice. What I'd like to do now is to turn to the invited discussants. And I'd like to start with the two discussants that we have online, who are Alexander Klein and Wade Robinson. Let's begin with Alexander Klein. If you'd like to please unmute yourself, Alex, and we'll go ahead and turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. All right, well, first, thank you for inviting me to come. Lauren, the book is super interesting, and I have more questions and comments than we have time for, but Let me start with this one. I work more on the 19th century, and some of the people I work on are Hume critics from the 19th century. So I hope you won't think the first question is anachronistic, but this is sort of my background. So the first question is, I suppose, an adaptation of a consideration that comes from Thomas Henry Huxley. So Huxley, of course, had a book on Hume in the 19th century. The example is not from the book, but I think it's interesting to consider with respect to your views. So let me just read a brief passage. You have on page 48, you're talking about the spatial extension of consciousness itself. And you say, we are not so well acquainted with what consciousness requires as to be able to say that there is a contradiction in the notion of a single conscious state that is extended without detriment to its unity. So I wanted to ask you to consider a case that comes from physiology from the 19th century, but I think it's relevant to the discussion. So the case comes from this article by T.H. Huxley called "Has a Frog a Soul?" And so the case goes like this. So he's not directly talking about Hume, but here's the example. He talks about cases where the spinal cord of a frog is divided. And so if you divide the spinal cord of a frog, you get two parts, but the two parts are actually, they both continue to be capable of purposive action. So like if an easy example he gives is like, even if you like decapitate the frog, the head continues to be capable of wincing, right? You put something like towards its face and it will wince in response. It seems to be some kind of purposive response. Huxley gives all kinds of examples that are much more complex than that. And they persist in sort of both, in both parts of the now severed creature. So Huxley asks, when the frog's spinal cord is cut, should we think that the frog's consciousness is now in both parts of the creature? Or is it just in one of them? And so he considers a few options, right? Option one is, well, maybe you say that the consciousness is now just in one part, right? Like maybe it's just in the head, and the lower part, even though it's still capable of some kind of purposive responses, like maybe there's just no consciousness there. But Huxley suggests that kind of view leads to what we would now call epiphenomenalism, right? Because if you think that what consciousness is doing is enabling some kind of purposive response to the environment, well, part of the creature is capable of doing this, right? I don't think you want to say that consciousness is epiphenomenal for Hume, but that's, I suppose, one sub-question here. Option two, in terms of the interpretation of what's going on with the divided frog, is, well, maybe you say that consciousness is somehow in both parts of the frog. And so then in that case, you say, well, is it like one consciousness that's now just been divided into these two different frog parts? That's kind of weird. You could take the two frog parts 1,000 miles apart from one another, right? And it starts to seem very unintuitive, right? That there's one consciousness that's so spatially extended that it could exist, in two things spread by 1,000 miles, let's say. Or maybe you think that the consciousness is divisible in this case, but if it's divisible, what accounts for that division in a Hume-style view where a conscious state is literally extended? Like, if I understand your answer to I forget the word you use for the problem, but the problem of explaining like why a complex conscious state is unified in one, your answer, I think, involves an appeal to association, right? But when you physically divide the frog, like association hasn't been broken down exactly. It's a physiological split. Like, why would there be a split in consciousness in that kind of case? So It's an odd example, but I think it, I don't know, maybe helps to think a little bit about what would be involved in conscious states that are literally extended. So that's the first long question.
To go ahead and respond, that's great.
Thanks, Alexander. This is great. This is a great comment. I think these sorts of things are, these sorts of cases are really interesting. They test our intuitions about what's going on. So I think here what we're called upon to do is think what Hume could have said. As opposed to what he did say, because this is not something that comes up. What I want to appeal to is in the discussion of consciousness, and this is where I was, and Donald might want to still get after me about this after what I've said. I think Donald and I agree on a lot. Pertaining to empirical givenness, the stuff is just brute factually there. And the main difference between us is that I see spatial boundaries as solving all the problems. That this is what accounts for such unity as consciousness has, is that there is a location in space identifiable with the tangible field, that's my body, which is somewhere, and an overlaid visual field. And what goes on within that location is the extent of consciousness, and it extends backwards in time a little ways. So that's the line that I've attributed to Hume, and I've tried to make it more of an 18th century line by saying this is the nature of complex impressions. Now, I think the way I would prefer to see Hume dealing with your kind of case is to say there come to be two disjoint consciousnesses. Where before there was one, it's like an amoeba splitting in two. Where before there was one, now there are two. And there's a sense in which the theory of identity no longer applies. Hume's theory of identity will no longer apply for reasons Hume scholars will know all too well. But even the idea, the position on identity that I would think Hume would have done better to advocate that's the view. Identity has to be 1-1. That is just a basic logical condition on identity, that one earlier state must map onto exactly one later state, and one later onto exactly one earlier. If it maps onto two, no more identity. If there's any ambiguity, we must suspend our decisions about what is identical. If there's nothing that it maps onto, that's death, or it hasn't been born yet. And then there are other conditions having to do with maximal proximity from moment to moment of maximally resembling things. I think applying that notion, once you get the split, your original consciousness effectively dies. Maybe you're two separate parts. If we're making it more radical and imagining split brain, corpus callosum being cut or something like that. We could say maybe both sides retain all the memories from before, but because it's ambiguous, which one is the most proximate, most resembling one to the state that was there before the split, we cannot make identity attributions. I'd say it's a kind of case that defies our identity attributions. And that this would perhaps be the kind of way you would.
Can I just to press on that a little bit? There's a line in the book where you talk about there's nothing strange about feeling cold on the left hand and warm on the right hand at the same time. Like you can have two experiences in a sense that are unified. And why are they unified? I think you're saying that they're unified for Hume because of the spatial contiguity of the impressions, maybe. But if that's the case, that the question with these frogs is, you can still have spatial contiguity, but presumably when you have this severance of the chord, you lose unity. So wouldn't you have the conditions for a unified consciousness when the chord is severed? Let's say you use a laser, right, to cut, crosswise across the frog's body. Like you still have
Right. I would just resist appealing to contiguity and association. I think this is givenness. It is you can only have associations built on what has earlier been given. And rather than talk about impressions being contiguous, I would talk about there being a field on which impressions occur. There is a tactile sensory field where impressions occur. And if you divide the field into two disjoint parts, and they are separated and one moves off somewhere else, that's what makes them disjoint. It's not that there's a failure of contiguity relations, it's that there has been damage done to the field itself. It's been separated into two parts.
Okay, thanks. I have another question if there's time, or I don't know.
Yeah, you have time for one more question.
Okay. So the next question is going to be me attempting to channel T.H. Green here, speaking of people with Kantian objections to Hume. So Green was a commentator who was very concerned about Hume's account of spatial relations in particular, as you may know. And so there's this passage from the treatise that Green harped on endlessly. So this is from 1.1.6. This is where Hume asks this is Hume's words, whether the idea of substance was derived from the impression or of sensation or reflection. If it be conveyed to us by our senses, I ask which of them, and after what manner. If it be perceived by the eyes, it must be a color. If by the ears, a sound. If by the palate, a taste, and so on of the other senses. And you refer to this and related passages a lot in the book. But Green is interested in the passage because he thinks that Hume relies very heavily on this kind of passage to rebut certain metaphysical ideas, like the idea of substance and whatever, right? So Hume had argued that since no impression of color, sound, etc., could serve as the source impression for the idea of substance to copy, then the idea of substance has to be dismissed, something like this. But so Green doesn't like this because he thinks that the same kind of argument is going to cause trouble for spatial relations. And this is where I wonder if you have a solution on Hume's behalf. So let me just read a short bit from Green. So Green says that Hume's account of spatial relations, quote, must imply that the disposition of points is at least a different idea from either color or tangibility, however impossible it may be for us to experience it without one or other of the latter. And then Green goes on, is this disposition then an impression of sensation? If so, through which of the senses is it received? If it be perceived by the eyes, it must be a color. So the argument goes on, it gets more detailed, but the basic thought is something like, if you're going to require, if substance isn't a coherent idea because, it's not a color, it's not a sound, right? It's not something that comes from any of our senses. Why can we talk about an idea of a disposition of parts, right? Why can we talk about an idea of a spatial relation? without identifying the source of its parts. We can't talk about leftness, right, as a visual idea. You can be blind and understand leftness. Green, I think, was probably not the only commentator to be uncomfortable with this idea that I think you rely on heavily, right? That our visual impressions are always disposed in a certain way, right? Like this is the thing that Green finds difficult to square with Hume's attack on certain metaphysical concepts. So do you have a response to Green, I guess?
Thank you, Alexander. It's a response that not everybody will accept. But it goes back to the idea that Hume is not a psychological atomist. If you think he is, I don't know that there's a response that can be given. But the line I want to take goes back to the introductory paragraphs of Book 2 of the treatise, where Hume describes sense impressions as originals. There is nothing that is more primitive than sense impressions. And that does not just apply to simples, it applies to complexes. So the line that Hume's remedy is pursuing is that original impressional sensory experience is like Carnap said it was, temporary total state. It is not just this color, that color, that color. It is a whole visual field, a whole tactile field. And the spatial manner of disposition is part of a complex impression. So it is sensory experience. You are experiencing it, but if you're thinking that the only legitimate impressions are simple impressions and that you can't have complex impressions, yeah, then it's a big problem. It's just that I would resist that interpretation.
But even if you're not an atomist, though, I think Green's thought is that order, the concept of spatial order has to be abstracted from any particular impression or idea, right? We never have a bare visual impression of leftness, right? It's colored points or colored, however you want to frame it, right? Disposed in a certain way. And when we think about leftness, we're abstracting away. And I think Green's worry is, well, why are we allowed to abstract away spatial relations, but we're not allowed to abstract away concepts like, substance?
Yeah. I don't have a good answer to that. I'm invested just in saying that you can abstract away, that you can abstract away spatial relations, and that Hume has a viable account of abstraction that allows us to do that. And that it also works the other way, that the notion of a simple, like a red point, is itself abstract, because you cannot experience a red point as a point unless it's against a background. What makes it a point is that it's hemmed in on all sides that are differently colored from it. And so you are, when you're thinking of a red point, you are in effect thinking of this point of redness that could be anywhere on a visual field, surrounded by any other kinds of backgrounds, and you are so abstracting from that. It is equally abstract. Now, I could maybe sit down for 10 minutes and think of a reason why you couldn't abstract substance that way. But my real investment is just saying you can abstract the spatial relations.
Fair enough.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll need to move on to Wade Robinson. Wade, if you'd like to please unmute yourself, and you can have the floor.
Thank you. I need to make two apologies up front. One of which is that we have 3 dogs. I'm at home, and there may be some woofing in the background as I speak. So my apologies if that causes a difficulty. The second is that I'm going to have to leave before the end of the entire session because I've got another meeting that I have to go to. So my apologies again for not being able to stay through the entire enterprise. I actually want to begin by complimenting Lauren. I've been to almost every single Hume Society meeting. I've missed only 2 out of 50. And one of the things that I pay attention to is who asks good questions and who, when they ask good questions, follow through with other good questions, allowing very, very good discussion. I take the whole point of the Hume Society to be to help the participants who are giving presentations make what they give better. And I want to compliment Lauren on doing a fantastic job over the years in helping other scholars, not just younger scholars, but other scholars improve their work. So that is a real service to Hume scholarship, and he deserves accolades for doing that. The other comment I want to make may seem like a criticism, but I don't think it is really. I think future potential graduate students are going to love Lauren. Because he has raised an incredible number of interesting questions, which shove the boundaries, as we can talk about space, of Hume scholarship in various ways, which can be the subject of a great many dissertations. So future Hume scholars are going to look in awe at Lauren's legacy and hopefully prove him wrong on a couple of points, but we'll see. Okay. So I have 2 very small questions. I thought they were small, maybe one isn't. In the introduction, even page 7, Lauren talks about Hume switching from talking about impressions to talking about objects. And he says, turns to talk about relations, causal relation in particular, from the language of impressions, ideas, and perceptions, it's abruptly abandoned in favor of preponderant use of the term object, exemplified by publicly observable external objects. I don't find that particularly problematic at all. If you look at the very end of section 2 of part 3, I guess it is, the section on probability and the idea of cause and effect, I'll quote, I shall only observe before I proceed any farther that though the ideas of cause and effect be derived from the impressions of reflection as well as from those of sensation, yet for brevity's sake, I commonly mention only the latter as the origin of these ideas, though I desire that whatever I say of them may also extend to the former. Passions are connected with their objects, and with one another, no less than external bodies are connected together. The same relation then of cause and effect, which belongs to one, must be common to all of them. He immediately launches into a long examination of the causal relation, and he uses the term objects throughout. And what he's doing there is, I thought, pretty straightforward. He is talking about external objects here, billiard balls and so on, rather than passions. And once he's finished with that, he moves on, for example, in Of Materiality of the Soul and in book 2, to talk about the causal relations between not objects, but impressions and of reflection and of sensation. So I don't find that problematic as switching back and forth. I think there's actually a method to what appears to be his madness.
Go ahead, Lauren.
I don't know that I've asked a question. I've made a point.
He made a point. I do want to say that I'm really pleased, Wade, that you said that I will provide employment to graduate students. And,
Yes, yes.
this
the
was
philosophy-
actually one of my aims in writing the book.
Hume scholarship will applaud you.
Yeah, I hope that turns out to be the case, and that I get people excited about these things and writing about them and showing me how I've gone wrong about that. So yeah, thank you for saying that, Wade. Thank you so much for the endorsement. Wade is the preeminent Hume scholar his generation, and to have your endorsement on the book, I was just so pleased that you were willing to do that. And Touche, I think you're right. What you say about that, yeah, there are all sorts of causal relations between impressions of reflection, particularly becoming very important in book 2. I do wonder, though, whether in book 1, he makes it too easy for himself to make the move from impressions to objects. But no, I take your point there.
But my second point, we'll go back to some of the issues that Alexander raised. Again, this is from the introduction. I mean, I think graduate students are going to be pleased to only have to read the introduction to find topics for their dissertations. This is on page 10. You say, on the Humean account, to have an idea of extension is to have an extended idea. And that strikes me as extremely puzzling. I think of what he says about on the immateriality of the soul, where, and I'll quote again, this is from 1:4-5:11. For anyone, excuse me, it's a question. For can anyone conceive a passion of a yard in length, a foot in breadth, and an inch in thickness? Thought, therefore, and extension are qualities wholly incompatible and never can incorporate together into one object, into one subject. It will not be surprising after this if I deliver a maxim which is condemned by several metaphysicians and is esteemed contrary to the most certain principles of human reason. This maxim is that an object may exist and yet be nowhere. I assert that this is not only possible, but that the greatest part of beings do and must exist after this matter. And then he goes on to talk about perceptions, etc., and passions. So I, as I say, I think a budding graduate student need only read page 10 of your introduction to find more than enough to begin to work out a dissertation. So again, a comment rather than a question, but I guess it's how
yeah, comment.
How can you possibly believe what you're saying?
The way I read 147, he is offering an argument he's reporting on an argument made by other people. And then the later comment, after making that comment, I think he immediately goes on to make an exception. He says, this is the case for all our impressions except those of vision and touch. I don't think he's saying it without qualification.
Well, we'd have to talk about the text here. I did not see it there, but at any rate, that's an issue.
Yeah. I would have to be able to make a case that he is making that exception.
Yeah, one more comment, I guess, about this. When he talks about contiguity in space at the very beginning, when he starts talking about the causal principle, he says, we'll assume that there's contiguity in space until later when we examine more carefully what objects are capable of contiguity in space. And I take it part of what he's doing in the immateriality of soul is answering that question, that some things are not capable of being contiguous in space.
Yeah, smells, tastes.
Yeah, so
yeah.
I don't see it as his laying out some other's position. I see it as laying out his own, but you know, we should have a panel somewhere at a Hume Society meeting, perhaps, where you present this very strange view.
It's strange.
And I comment on it.
Did you follow up on my quotation from my allusion to William James?
Yeah, I did not,
You
actually.
didn't? There's a point where I'm referencing various people who've discussed human consciousness and saying they might agree with me or they might have
Oh,
the
right.
sentiment that James attributed to Wundt and Helmholtz and the sailor. And it's one of those wonderful James passages. He's talking about, I forget who it was, but he says, after this German scholar wrote what he did, Helmholtz and Wundt changed their minds because of the riotous use he had made. And he makes this comparison to the sailor whose horse got its foot caught in the stirrup. And the sailor says, if you are going to get on, it's time for me to get off.
There you go.
I'm afraid that's what some people might think after they read what I've read, that now it's time to change their minds about the riotous use I have made of their theses.
Well, I will pass the baton on to the next speaker, if I may.
Great, thank you, Wade. I'm very pleased that you're able to join us for as long as you can today, so thank you. So we're going to turn to our guests who are present in the room with us. So I'd like to begin with Donald Ainslie. Donald, if you could please unmute yourself. And
Can I do it from here? Does that work? Sort of? Should I go up or should I?
People won't be able to see you, but they can hear you.
They need to see me. I'll go up.
Well, actually, Wesley, I think, can point the camera at you.
Right.
If,
Dark.
This is a high-tech space.
Think we got it?
Okay, so should
that's not a very good image, Wesley.
where am I?
So, Donald, it might be best to go to the podium. Thank you.
Now, what do we do with this one?
Oh, you just leave your stuff there, Lauren. It's okay.
I just need some space to put mine down.
You guys need to just share it, I think.
All right.
Do you need to share your screen?
No, I just need to get this out of the way so I can read my computer. Is that gonna be a problem? Okay. Okay, hello. Thanks, everyone, and congratulations, Lauren. It's a fantastic book. I will admit I haven't had the chance to read all of it, but the parts I've read, I have been fascinated by, challenged by, learned from. So thank you for this book, for your scholarship over the years, your support for younger scholars, your leadership in the Hume community. It's all in the Canadian philosophical community, in the history of philosophy. It's wonderful. You know, Lauren's a generation ahead of me, and I've always learned from his work and admired him personally, not least for his cycling prowess. The book, we've all been looking forward to it, and it doesn't disappoint. And it's incredibly carefully argued. It's deep philosophically. And one of the things that's really interesting about the book is that, as we heard in the précis earlier, it's not just sort of exposition, though there's lots of that, but there's a lot of criticism of Hume. So for a book on Hume, it's not one of those ones which wants to find ways of having Hume come out, making sense in all the ways you might want. It's rather sometimes pushing against Hume and saying, look, no, this breaks down. But there's this added twist that he says, but had Hume thought about it a little harder, he could have used the very tools he's already put on the table to solve this problem that I've made for him. So it's kind of a fascinating book. In that way. Methodologically, it's also fascinating for the Hume world of Hume scholars, is that he centers his interpretation on what is the least loved section of the treatise, I think, which is of the immateriality of the soul. That's book 1, part 4, section 5. It's certainly of all the sections of book 1 of the treatise on the understanding, it's the most neglected section. In fact, when I'm teaching this stuff and we get to 145, I never know what to assign because the secondary literature is so slim, but I always assign Lawrence paper on Hume and Reed on 145. It's a tricky section. It's the second longest section of the treatise. It's very heterogeneous. It talks about lots of different things. It opens with a discussion of the coherence of the suggestion that the soul might be a substance. And in there, he kind of recapitulates stuff he's already said. He's treated the falsity of the notion of substance as traditionally conceived in book 1, part 4, section 3 on the ancient philosophy, and is in initial treatment of the idea of substance way back in book 1, part 1. Then there's the discussion of whether perceptions could be locally conjoined to the mind, as if perceptions somehow belong to the mind by being inside it, rather than as the substance theorists would have it, inhering in it. And this is where Lawrence finds such crucial material for his interpretation, especially the discussion of the extendedness of perceptions. Some perceptions are extended, some aren't, how do non-extended and perceptions that are nowhere and extended perceptions go together, and that's the dynamic Hume explores. There's a long, it's not clear exactly why it's there, discussion of Spinoza, where Hume uses criticisms of Spinoza to argue that that also is a way for rejecting the view of the soul as simple and unitary. Very unusual discussion. Hume, it's the only time Hume gives an extended discussion of any other philosopher in the treatise. There's a discussion of whether perceptions might be rationally distinct from the mind, a discussion of their bodily causes, and then there's something of a postscript on the relationship between religion and philosophy. I've argued myself that the section has to be read in terms of Hume's distinction between different kinds of philosophy, different kinds of false philosophical systems. He thinks there are ancient philosophical systems that are committed to substance metaphysics, and so there's the ancient metaphysics of the external world, and then ancient metaphysics of the internal world, views which take the soul to be a substance. Spinoza counts as an ancient in this taxonomy in that respect, or some, well, Spinoza's tricky because there's Hume's misunderstanding of Spinoza and what Spinoza actually thought. And then there are modern systems of the external and internal world, where the modern system of the external world is any system that has the primary quality, secondary quality distinction. And the modern system of the internal world is any view that takes the mind to be characterized by fundamental self-consciousness, where we're aware of ourselves as the same thinking thing in different times and places, just as by the very structure of the mind. In saying he's going to look at these different philosophical systems, he says this investigation perhaps will not be found foreign to our present purpose. And what he does in these 4 sections looking at philosophical systems is elaborates and qualifies his various views. So we get the bundle view of the mind and the discussion of personal identity, the modern system of the internal world, and we get the discussion of extended perceptions that Lawrence takes to be fundamental to his project. So I think the book is kind of fascinating because he reads a lot of the Humean system through passages which most people kind of neglect. And then he also reads these passages in a way retrospectively through the eyes of Reed, and I think Kant is lurking in the background too, the topic of Lawrence's first book. But I think this retrospective view pays off handsomely. And I especially love the discussion of consciousness. When I teach Hume, I forbid students to use the word consciousness because I think consciousness is in the 18th century a word that's in a lot of flux. Clarke at one point in his correspondence with Collins has a footnote where he says, this word consciousness can mean one of 5 different things, but it doesn't really matter. For the purposes of our discussion, you can use it any way you want to. Think about how when Locke writes the essay and the word consciousness is all over the place, his translators struggle. So Leibniz says, well, in the new essays, he says, I can't use the word conscience in any sort of normal way, because it's not exactly the French notion of conscience. It's rather, I'm going to put a hyphen in it. It's going to be conscience. So I'm going to, or sorry, conscientité in Leibniz. He says, going to make up a new word because his Lockean consciousness is so novel way of understanding the structures of the mind. It's Cost in his translation of the essay, who says, when Locke uses conscious and consciousness, it doesn't fit into the French very well. So I'm going to set it up with conscience as a hyphen between them. So there's this sense that consciousness is kind of, it's not very clear what it means. It doesn't figure much in Hume's philosophy. He doesn't use the word all that often, and he uses it in a couple of different ways, as Lauren acknowledges. There's another book that I actually don't know if you talk much about it. Wayne Waxman has a book called Hume's Theory of Consciousness. Does that appear in your?
Maybe once.
Yeah, and I actually I really love the book because I think everything in it is wrong, including the title. But it's very revelatory as to what's going on. Like Hume doesn't have a theory of consciousness, and so what does that mean? The way Waxman approaches it is he says, look, Hume thinks perceptions are mental objects, something like Lockean ideas. And so you need some sort of state, mental activity that we take towards these mental objects, and that's consciousness. So Hume has to have a theory of consciousness because he has mental objects. And I think what's great about Waxman is that that is the standard view of Humean perceptions, that they're kind of mental objects, and this is what I'm going to press Lauren on in a moment, because we've gone back and forth on this over the years. If perceptions are mental objects, it does seem like he needs some theory of consciousness, if you want to call it that. You know, Locke has ideas as mental objects, and he thinks we perceive ideas. So he has mental acts with mental objects. Hume just has perceptions. And I think the lack of a theory of consciousness is a suggestion that maybe the assumption that makes it required is wrong, that perceptions for Hume, properly understood, aren't mental objects, but rather states of awareness, mental states, mental episodes, perceivings, ultimately, rather than perceptions, not something in front of the mind, but rather states of being aware. And what I find interesting in the book is that Lauren, I couldn't figure out which side he comes down on in this debate. Hume himself is frustratingly ambiguous in how he treats perceptions. So it certainly is the case that he will say that, particularly in the skeptical parts of the treatise, perceptions are our only objects. Okay, perceptions are objects. That's clear. But then he also says at various times that things that make it seem like no, perceptions are perceivings. They're actions of the mind in which we're aware of something. And he will equate perceptions with actions in the mind. Perceptions can be associated both in terms of how they feel as actions of the mind and as how their content might resemble. There are different ways perceptions can resemble. And I think, therefore, that Hume ultimately has to see perceptions as having two aspects. On the one hand, at least sensory perceptions, particularly those visual and tangible ones, have an imagistic disposition of points as their most immediate content. But the perception itself is the awareness of those. So the red, there isn't sort of a red impression before the mind. There's the seeing of red, which is the impression, not the redness, but the seeing. And sometimes Lauren goes one way and sometimes he goes the other. Sometimes he says, like, we experience perceptions, comes up a few times, as if somehow the mind is a bundle of perceptions, and in addition, the experiencings of them, which conflicts with the bundle theory. Just as an aside, Lauren reads Hume through 145. I tend to read Hume through 146. So I think the bundle theory is kind of a core Humean position, and anything you say about Hume ultimately has to conform with the bundle theory, which maybe is a problem because he does end up having lots of problems with it in the appendix, but that's the way I go. So I guess I want to ask Lauren this question. At one point you say, impressions are the sensible qualities themselves. And I'm quoting you here from page 29. In Hume's language, objects of touch means are tactile sensations. So the sensations are the objects of touch. I would have thought the sensations were the experience of touching. We touch things, points, dispose, thus and so. The sensations are the touchings. So take the seeing. I see a kind of white computer screen in front of me right now. Is the whiteness the impression? Which sometimes it sounds like what you think, because you talk about sensible qualities as what impressions are, or is the seeing of the whiteness thus and so the impression? And let's bracket the question of how this relates, the seeing of the white thus and so versus the seeing of the computer screen, which is, you know, conceptually mediated and so on. But at the basic level, which one goes first for you? Just to say that I think there's some kind of ambiguity in the way you talk about it in the book, in a way reflecting Hume's ambiguity. There's a point, let's see if I can find this, where you say, where you identify perceptions as states of consciousness. And even in the précis today that you gave us, let's see if I can get it to there. You just said in your précis, sense impressions, ideas, and passions are conscious states. So that sounds like you're on my side of the debate in the secondary literature, whether they're objects or objects of the mind or states of awareness. And I guess I'll stop there and leave that as a question for you. And then I have a second question if there's time.
Thanks, Donald.
This is a disagreement that we had many years ago. And in the time, actually, even while I was working on them, so, well, let me just say first, I'm guilty. And you're right. And I endorse your position. You know, there's a lot of inadvertent, even while I was writing the book, I would catch myself and go back and correct passages to rewrite them because I don't think that Hume's view is that there is anything behind the perceptions that perceives the perceptions. And that was a point you made many years ago. And I think that's right. There is just the perceptions which are, but yeah, if I get to do a second edition, I want to go back and I want to try. So I guess the real issue is there anywhere I am using the objectionable language where I can't write it out? And that's something I have to think about. But I do regret any expression that implies that there are that these are objects rather than states of awareness.
I'd like to leave time for Johnny. We're kind of short, but thanks, Donald.
Thank you, Lord.
So next, I'd like to ask Jonathan Cottrell to join us. And would you like to go up to the front, please? Or
I would love to do some slides if I could.
Okay, I will make you a co-host, and then you should be able to share.
And will I go up front?
Probably no need if he's doing it.
Are you on the Zoom at the moment?
No, I'm not on the Zoom.
Yeah, you have to be on the Zoom before I can make you a co-host.
I don't have the session information.
Okay.
Do you have a USB?
I could just could I email you the?
Yeah, email me the slides and I can show them. That's probably the best.
I'll do his other question in the meantime.
you want me to, do I get to, you said
Yeah, while we've got some downtime, you go ahead and ask, Donald.
okay, my question is, in a way, I was going to ask a bigger question about how you conceive of Hume's account of seeing everyday objects, like, you know, there's the lectern over there, so window behind me, all those sorts of ways we think about everyday objects. And you said in your précis, and I thought it was really fascinating, you said it, it says it takes some work to account for how a field of spatially indifferently disposed, colored or tactile points take on the character of a private image of an apple or a table. I totally agree that, yes, it takes more work to identify such images, which are temporary and perspective dependent with multifaceted enduring mobile objects that change in regular ways over time, such as the lectern and so on. I think the sense in which Hume identifies images with that needs a lot to be unpacked there, but yeah. But then you said Hume never did that work. Did he not do that in 142? Isn't that what 142 is? 142 is the discussion of skepticism with regard to senses, which has it's a very Baroque section. It's the longest section of the treatise, but has a very long discussion of how, on the basis of impressions that have constancy or coherence, end up leading us to take there to be a world that exists independent of us.
I cannot conceive how such trivial operations of the imagination guided by such false presuppositions can ever lead to any solid and lasting system. That's a quote from Hume from the close of 142. I think yeah, you're right. He tried. and the line that Hume's remedy takes, Hume offered various skeptical arguments. And I think he was more upfront about what he was trying to do with regard to the remedy in the inquiry than the treatise, but that he already had the project in the treatise, but he just was not as upfront about it. And that at the same time, he strained to come up with all sorts of skeptical arguments. And that the job in 142, the first half of 142, where he tries to do that, account for how constancy, yeah, he is trying to do that. But at the same time that he's trying to do it, he's disparaging the success of his enterprise. And he wanted that to be an initial skeptical argument before he ever got around to the veil of perception arguments. He wanted this exposure of the inadequacies to be the skeptical argument.
Is Johnny ready, or can I push on that?
I think we're ready down here, so let's hold off till dinner. Johnny, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Is this, wait, do I do share?
Just all you do is hit share.
Hold on,
There
how's
we go.
that? See these? Yeah, okay. Perfect, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Benjamin and Lorne, for inviting me to be here. Thanks, Lorne, for giving us the book that's provided the occasion for this. It's a humbling experience preparing comments on this book. Others have praised it. I think it deserves more praise than has yet been heaped upon it. It's a wonderful book. It sets a standard of philosophical and scholarly work that is aspirational for me. It is philosophically insightful, it's creative, rigorously developed. It's informed by a rich understanding of the intellectual context that Hume was working in, but at the same time shows fantastically keen-eyed attention to the finest details of the passages that it engages with. Along the way, Lorne is generous enough to engage with some bad ideas due to this guy Cottrell 2019. Probably the less said about that guy, the better.
Inspirational. Its remarks apply.
On top of all of that, the book is extremely thorough. Lorne has thought of everything, so it's unclear what exactly I'm going to add in these comments, but I shall try. So I'm going to ask Lorne some questions focusing on his account of perceptual consciousness. especially in chapter 1, but also it's elaborated in chapter 6 of the book. And the questions are going to take a little bit of stage setting. So that's what I'm hoping to do with these slides. Hoping to do it with these slides, but I actually can't do anything with these. Can't do anything with these slides right now. Sorry, what am I doing wrong?
I don't know.
Great, thank you. So in the background here are 3 views that Hume holds, that Lorne, I think, rightly attributes to Hume. So spatial disposition, visual and tactile impressions are spatially disposed. So when you experience, for example, a blue point to the left of a red point, you literally have a blue impression to the left of a red impression. The second is depthless vision. So Hume follows Berkeley in holding that the visual field does not have depth. The visual field is 2-dimensional, whereas the tactile field is 3-dimensional. And then the third is placeless perceptions. So Hume, as Lorne has mentioned, thinks that non-visual, non-tactile impressions are not spatially disposed. They are, Hume says, nowhere. So those are the commitments in the background here. And against the background of these 3 commitments, Lorne raises 2 problems for Hume in chapter 1, which he calls the comprehension problem and the limitation problem. So the comprehension problem is this: how do we obtain a unified consciousness of spatially distributed information? So Lorne sort of illustrates this problem with Bayle's example of a globe. Bayle says, how does this spatially extended globe get to know the world as a whole when each part of the globe only knows the portion of the world that it represents? And James's famous example of the 12 men, each of whom has one word from a 12-word sentence in their mind, but there's no awareness of the sentence as a whole. And then the limitation problem is what limits the size of impressions. Why don't my impressions include more parts than they do? So starting with the comprehension problem, Lorne rejects 2 solutions. I think correctly, I was completely convinced here. So there's an associationist solution which says that we learn to associate these spatially distributed impressions, and this is what unifies them. But to this, Lorne objects that association can't do the job because association presupposes prior unified experiences. And since it presupposes this form of the unity of consciousness, association cannot explain it. And then the spiritualist solution is that impressions are unified by inhering in the same soul. But Lorne, Lorne poses a really nice dilemma for this view, which is, look, is this soul extended or not? If the soul is extended, then we're just back to square one, because we're back with Bayle's problem of the globe. And if the soul is extensionless, then we have another problem, which is how can an extensionless soul possibly contain these spatially extended complex impressions? So Lorne has convinced me that neither of those solutions is going to work.
Let's see that. Oh, sorry. Okay. All right.
So Lorne's preferred solution appeals to a kind of priority of the whole. Lorne says that in the case of a complex impression, the whole precedes the parts. So a complex impression is originally given as a spatially ordered whole. And this whole is not just the sum of its parts, but rather it is the parts in certain spatial relations to each other. So I am given the spatial disposition, the spatial relatedness of my blue and red point impression together with those impressions themselves as part of a single whole. So that's the solution to the comprehension problem. To the limitation problem, Lorne says that there is an empirically given solution, which is that the limits of the visual and tactile fields are empirically given limits for visual and tactile impressions. So the limit of the field constrains the content that the field can have. Only so much content will fit into my visual or tactile field. But then the question is, what about complexes that include non-visual, non-tactile impressions? As for example, when I perceive my coffee cup as being both, you know, a white cylinder that smells good, and so forth. And Lorne thinks that Hume doesn't have a satisfactory solution to this problem at his disposal. But Lorne points out that this is an offering on Hume's behalf. Lorne points out that Hume could solve this problem by giving up the placeless perceptions thesis. So Lorne says that Hume's best alternative rests with spatializing as much of our experience as possible. So he says there was nothing compelling Hume to maintain that there are perceptions that are not in space. Hume could plausibly have said that all non-visual perceptions are localized on the tactile field. So for example, he could have treated tastes and smells as tactile sensations specific to the mouth and nose regions of the tactile field. Sounds are originally located in the tactile space between the ears. There's not much we can experience, Lorne says, that cannot be localized in visual or tactile space. But this brings me to my first question for Lorne, which is, how does visual spatial information get to be unified with tactile spatial information? Because remember, the visual field is a different space from the tactile field. It's a two-dimensional depthless space, whereas the tactile field, Lorne says, is a three-dimensional space that has the shape of my body. Giving up placeless perceptions in the way that Lorne suggests allows Hume to unify all but our visual impressions on the tactile field. But then how does the visual field get to be associated, not associated, that's the wrong word. How does the visual field get to be unified with the tactile field? So Lorne says that we learn to correlate the visual with the tactile. He says that in most human beings, consciousness extends over one visual field and one tactile field, that the visual and tactile fields are paired, and that my perceptions are those that occur within the bounds of my tactile field, my body, and an overlaid visual field. But my question is, how does this get to be the case? How do we learn to correlate these fields? How does consciousness come to extend over both of them? How do they come to be paired or overlaid one with the other? And the only answer that I've been able to find so far in the book is an associationist one. So Lorne says that the visual and tactile fields might likewise be said to be associated. Visual and tactile space are originally experienced as discrete, but we learn to associate their contents, and that a complex impression is an entire visual field associated with an entire tangible field. But remember that Lorne has rejected associationist solutions to the comprehension problem. He rejected the idea that what unifies the parts of the visual field is their being associated with each other. And so what I want to know is, why doesn't that earlier objection to the associationist answer apply equally well here too, to this problem of unifying the visual with the tactile? And to be fair, I think Lorne maybe thinks that the objection does apply here too. He says appeals to association resurrects the comprehension problem, but I haven't been able to find a solution in the book. So what I'd like to do with my remaining time is suggest 4 possible solutions that have occurred to me as I've been thinking about the book. And this will take me to my next and last question for Lorne, which is, do you like any of these, or is there a better one? Basically, I think they all have problems. So one solution is temporal. Perhaps Hume can let time do the work. Because as Lorne points out, as well as being spatially disposed, our impressions are temporally disposed. So some complex impressions are given as temporally ordered wholes with earlier and later parts. So can Hume perhaps say that my visual field and my tactile field are unified in virtue of being given as parts of the same temporally ordered whole, within which they bear the relation of simultaneity to each other? So maybe that's one thing that Hume might say, but I worry that he'll now run into a version of the limitation problem, because I have a visual field and you have a tactile field, and they both exist right now, but your tactile field is not unified with my visual field. So it doesn't seem like mere simultaneity by itself can do the work that needs to be done here. So moving on, could mereology do the work? Could we say, look, forget spatial and temporal relations. All that matters is that impressions are given as parts of a whole. So could my visual and tactile fields be given as parts of a whole, independently of their spatial and temporal relations? And in fact, could they be given as parts of a whole despite the fact that they are not spatially related to each other, the visual and tactile field? I worry, I'm less confident, but I worry that we might run into a limitation problem again, or at least to avoid it, Hume might have to appeal to brute mereological facts. It's just a brute fact that my visual field and my tactile field are given as parts of a unified whole, whereas my visual field and your tactile field are not given as parts of a unified whole. Could Hume accept brute mereological facts like that? I'm not sure. On either of these solutions, by the way, there would be no need for Hume to give up the placeless perceptions doctrine. Because if time can unify the visual fields with the tactile field, presumably it can unify the aspatial perceptions with the spatial ones as well. And similarly, if brute mereological facts can unite the visual field with the tactile field, presumably they could unite aspatial perceptions with those fields as well. A third possibility, which I think is farther from the spirit of Lawns, is to appeal to causal relations, not associative relations, but causal relations. Say, look, the visual and tactile, my visual and my tactile field are unified in virtue of the fact that they produce effects jointly, or at least in virtue of the fact that they are sort of apt to produce joint effects. But my worry with that solution is that any joint effect that you could point to as plausibly doing the work is itself going to give rise to versions of the comprehension problem. So I'm not confident about that as well. That takes me to a fourth and final possible solution, which I take to have been Berkeley's. The visual field is unified with the tactile field in virtue of their both being intentional objects of a single act of awareness attributed to a single mental substance. So the mental substance and its acts of awareness are what provide the unity here. Of course, Hume can't accept this. He rejects too much of, he rejects the intelligibility of too much of Berkeley's metaphysics for him to accept that solution. But I'll just finish with this conjecture. I wonder if the philosophical lesson from Lawns' discussion of these issues is that if you want to be as much of a Berkeleyan about the contents of vision and touch as Hume does, that is, if you want to say that vision and touch present you with different spaces, such as Lawns' visual field and tactile field, then maybe you have to take on Berkeleyan views about mental substances and acts of awareness as well, on pain of running into insuperable comprehension and limitation problems. Thanks again, Lorne, for the stimulus to all of this discussion.
Thank you, Johnny. These are very deep and astute comments. You've done a great job of bringing out a real problem. Can you put the four options back?
I can't, but Benjamin might be able to.
Sorry, I just give me a second.
And I'm going to have to think more about this, but the occasion calls for some flippant initial comments. But no, these are really good. This is a really valuable set of considerations. I think the Berkeleyan solution has to be rejected because I'm agreeing with Don, and I think rightly that I don't think Hume wants to countenance any kind of mental substance that is perceiving this stuff. Clearly, there is a problem because there is no path through space from any point in the visual space to any point in the tactile space. Yet we are able to put them together somehow. I think, so this is my initial flippant attempt to come up with some response. that there has to be a brute factual element here. When I rejected association, it was in connection with comprehension problem, which is solved in the way that you say that, but there are two larger spaces. I think we have to talk about, we will probably need to talk about association to get those two spaces together, and perhaps at two levels. That one would be a brute factual level. That brute factually, a being that has a certain tactile, or a being that is a certain tactile space, is able to make associations of tactile experience with a particular visual field that is you can re-identify it over time on the basis of theory of identity that I've said Hume had. So there is one visual field that can be re-identified over time that the being with that tactile field is able to make associations with. And that is just brute fact. One and no other. But then we can speculate about why that brute fact obtains. And then we can start using this objectionable language that that maybe it's because the tactile field is embedded in a larger space and the visual field is also in that larger space, and the one is overlaid or partially overlaid with the other in some, that's my first stab at a possible solution, but no, good on you. You've come up with difficult. So I don't know if or anybody else thinks that there might be issues. That's my best attempt, right?
Great. Thank you, Lauren. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers. Rob, did you have a comment or?
I have a follow-up, but we can thank everybody first.
Okay, let's thank all of our speakers for today, both online and in person. And I'm gonna interrupt you, Rob, sorry, but we do have another session. So we want to allow for people to take a break that need a break. So let's, if you want to take a break, Rob, I would like to let you ask your question, and then we can maybe take a short break.
Thank you. Okay, maybe we can ponder it over the break. I just wondered, there was a solution that occurred to me, and I want to know why this is clearly out on Hume's view, which is that I can see my hand touching my knee. I can see my fingers touching each other. So it seems like there's some overlap there between the tactile space and the visual space that would allow me to learn some correlations between them.
Yeah. Well, Johnny, maybe, because it's your point. You were saying, why is it that there's just the one visual space that gets correlated? Why couldn't it be?
Yeah, so what I see for Hume is not literally identical to what I touch, right? So I see contiguity between a color patch that we call my hand and a color patch that we call my knee, say. Simultaneously, I feel I have some tactile sensations in, if you like, my tactile hand and my tactile knee, but there are really four objects there. There's the visual hand, the visible hand, the visible knee, the tactile hand and the tactile knee. And the question is, how do I learn to pair, as it were, the visual pairing with the tactile pairing? And I think it can't be on the basis of observing spatial relations, because I don't observe any spatial relation between the visual pair and the tactile pair.
That's the thing I hadn't realized. Okay.
Well, thanks, Rob. Thanks for that idea. And let's take a short break. And then we'll reconvene in about 10 minutes. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, shall I just log off?
Or just unplug.
Just unplug.
Yep, so I just need this one. I don't think I need.
You don't need this part?
I'm team PC.
It's frozen right now, but basically, so the screen is frozen right now. Basically, what we're gonna do is you're gonna share your screen so that it appears on the Zoom.
Yep.
And then you're gonna go back to the PowerPoint.
Yep.
Because I'm then going to route the image on the projector to whatever coming out the HDMI port.
Okay.
So, well, when you share it, you're gonna be on this.
Yeah.
but-
Okay.
So.
Good.
It's hard to imagine.
Right, so I wonder if it's all. Yeah, because you've just got these primitively taken two different spaces. It's nice, yeah. You know, how they could do.
I went to a couple of grad seminars with information. No, I'm researching independently. I think.
Yeah.
Yes, I have a solution for my guy.
Since I have space and time exception, and I am actually. Really what?
Like it goes to fruition.
I'm a tactile. Like. The tactile videos. That's part of the worry. Yeah, I am an individual too, and I am a tactile.
Living in salt, or is that?
I don't separate. That's. Somebody asks, and I separate them because I need to be conscious of aware of the fact that I'm touching or I'm seeing. But I am. I am. Anything else? So. It is the more I presentation. Isolation. Of the third. Secondary literature. Well, I'm coupling up stuff to look. And then I have. He is the body philosopher. It's fine. Just something that people even hadn't insisted on. Now people retroactive can say, oh no, I can find the body in Hegel. Or I can find the body in Kant. But Kant didn't think that he was a body. And Hegel didn't think that he was a body. You to cobble something up after the fact. But well, because bodies, we are a body. No, I think mind is probably a problem. Because when you say mind, then you're up with these problems of the separation. Mind is this, and mind is that. But body is everything.
It's not the body, we kind of merely.
Let's
say we should be like naive and right, that there's a kind of lived body or something like that.
But we are a lived
material.
We are a lived material body. I think the problem,
The point is that it's kind of a happening.
No. Yeah, I think. I think the emphasis has to be. And not what separate itself from itself as the fact, like analyze it. Now I sense, and now I feel. Sense and I feel. that I'm this Kantian self, sitting aside from myself. Well, I analyze myself, I'm doing, I'm just doing.
No, there's this states of awareness.
I think we're like the solution.
I don't know that he's aware of.
I mean, so part of it is like you want to appeal to kind of a.
20% of that.
No, because the movie makes it sound like it's enough.
I'm sure that you.
Smelling, tasting, seeing, feeling. Those are all some.
No, I would take it.
It's just very exists, but there are no main subjects. The subject is the sum of those.
Yeah.
There's no superintending, no superintending subject.
Would not have been.
In each of those experiences.
Either consensus, not
Each perception has. Being of the black.
That's
a visual. Yeah. It's not you. Person in front of me, that would require all sorts of stuff to work on his story, so. It's just.
even though not that different.
Don't have.
Be thinking.
Thanks for joining us. I've had cancellations, so I got
Schopenhauer, which is what he calls the.
Is
working. If you want, and
I've actually had to go up. I've acquired a case for Schopenhauer teaching kindergarten.
Well, thanks for coming today. Here for the talk.
Before it's going
There's. In the internal, internal to the perception, that image is being perceived.
I'm doing it the first edition.
Only rationally distinct from the mental. But then,
I mean, it's
the imagination works on things the right way. Image arrange this, and so that is what it's to be aware of. Persistence. So it's not exactly representationalist in the sense of the inner. But it's in having.
You guys have a title sponsor?
That's all right. No, that's my Halloween costume in years before
It's business, it's.
odd years, because I teach 17th century one semester and 18th century the other semester. So I have a t-shirt and a hard hat from youth. Well, makes sense why I make such a
Yeah, so he it is a kind of adverbial view, certainly for ones like passions and feelings, and so those are really that's really adverbial. Is it spelled adverbially?
No,
I think we already over time anyway.
Piece of more object oriented stuff. Yeah. Maybe, I don't know, it's more.
and I should have just relaxed and realized as
You plugged yourself.
I did.
Very good.
Yeah, no, I was mortified when Johnny lost, or you lost power.
No, that was Lauren's in power.
Oh.
So we were, the screen was from,
Yeah, no, that's one of the things that wakes me up in cold
You can
sweats.
farm
is
it.
Internet cuts out or.
Yeah.
I thought we had it all taken care of, and then
I got picked for being a co-host. Couldn't let anybody in. Yeah, it worked out.
the timing was fine. We'll have a chance for the people to ask questions during dinner.
Praise.
And that's. I don't agree. Given as. Suitable, essentially multifaceted spread.
Right, right, it's a question of.
I think it has to be like every.
Yeah, and you know, I offer this.
It's the opposite, it's the opposite.
Pretty much, yeah. But the Heidegger scholars will admit to that.
Well, we should sometime next week.
Yeah. Leslie, do you want to be in charge of passing?
Yeah, sure. Let's make sure I have my copy. Yep, I have my copy. For everybody else.
Here's the results. Yeah, for example. Give them a few more minutes and then.
I don't understand what's in our.
In there as well.
He wrote Howard's first
Agreed with himself.
section of the paper.
Points,
Mitchell.
context.
Something about our sponsors to make sure we do diligent.
So I. Went to customer. So I. Briefing note on your paper.
That's right. You didn't arrange the small gifts. I didn't arrange.
Somewhere there you actually.
Bigger, small ones.
Are you guys unionized?
Nice. So you want me to?
It's the engineers that are the problem. They're treated very, very nice. They get market adjustment.
They get all the perks and they won't keep for them.
Yeah, yeah, I think we're gonna drag them down. Probably right. Anything else?
Andy.
Yep. Okay.
No. So,
Makes it more interesting than anything else.
This is pretty well.
Hey, everyone, can I get your attention? Can we start filling up our coffee cups and gathering back up so we can start the next section, please? And we can not run late. Thanks, everybody.
No, we canceled it. You have you put some in the box relating to that. Now you do.
If I check my email.
Yeah, there's a couple of people who are. Okay. That's why you were here.
Yeah, it's,
Oh, the birth of tragedy. Okay.
I become a polite Canadian.
What is it? Started actually reading this or some say
Everybody, let's kind of return to our seats, please. I'd like to get started.
Yeah, it's just alcohol.
Yeah.
So I'd like to again thank everyone for coming. I'm very pleased that we have Anne-Marie Butler from Iowa State here today, who's going to give the keynote for the small conference that we've had. And it coincides with a department colloquium talk. So I'm very pleased that you've all decided to join us today. I have a couple of small things to do housekeeping wise first. So first of all, I have to thank all of our sponsors, the things that we have to normally do. And I'd like to thank the Dean of the Arts and Humanities, the Vice Provost of Research Western, and the Chair of the Philosophy Department, Corey Dyke, for supporting this conference and the food and drinks that we have been enjoying. So thank you, everybody. And I also have some small gifts for our speakers today. So I'd like to distribute them. Lauren, for you, thank you. And Donald and Johnny. Thank you for coming down and
Completely unexpected, that's unnecessary, but do love swag.
I hope that you every time you drink your coffee, you think of Lauren and have a good time with you. So Thanks, everyone.
And-
Not when you drink coffee every time yet, right? So thank you. And without any further ado, I'd like to please welcome Anne-Marie Butler to talk about Continuants.
Thank you, Ben. Ben and I were graduate students together at Iowa, University of Iowa, a long, long time ago, or a little while ago. At that time, we were both students under Phil Cummins, who was, by the time I was a graduate student, in phased retirement. And as a result, we had very preeminent scholars come in semesters while Phil was away to teach modern philosophy classes. And that's how I first met Lauren Falkenstein. So we did our readings. I was preparing for comps, and we did a very intense readings that was tremendously helpful. And I continue to think very fondly of just how much territory we had covered. We were doing theories of space and time from Descartes to Kant. And as you know, Lauren, very well, that was primary figures, secondary figures, tertiary figures, right? We covered the whole range. It was intense, it was amazing, and I thank you deeply for it. At the time, Lauren had cautioned me to be careful with the principle of charity, that you can wield it too charitably. And I think your book gives us instruction on when to pull back and just say, no, Hume made a mistake. And so I fully expect to be accused of, again, being too charitable to Hume and continuing in my juvenile mistakes. But with that, I want to begin this talk. And this talk is a little bit strange. It's stitched together. So it's reflecting on two different pieces of work that I've done and thinking about Lauren's work in light of that. So the first piece that I want to talk about is an interpretation of Hume on personal identity. So I think I've put my finger on what Hume's problem in the appendix is. And what I'm going to argue is that the criticism that he raises is restricted only to belief in personal, one's own identity. It does not extend to other identity attributions. What we'll discover from that, so section 3 will go very quickly. Section 2 is exceedingly long. Section 3 will discover that continuants are formed in thought. We do not encounter in experience continuants. And then I turn to Falkenstein on space and time. Our speakers and Lauren and his précis acquainted us with his intuitionism that he attributes to Hume. And I'm going to push back against that and say that it doesn't quite get us all that Lauren seems to think that it does. And I want to use Locke as my helper here. And this is another piece of scholarship of mine that I'm drawing upon, where I've worked on trying to understand how Locke thinks that we get the ideas of space and time and how we use those to acquaint ourselves with the real entirety, immensity of space and eternity of time. So what I argue is happening in 146 of personal identity and Hume's criticism of his own account in the appendix is he's wrestling with what I call the updating problem. So suppose that I form a belief in self at one time, say last week, and then sometime later, say during the break, I form a belief in self. The question is, those two beliefs, are they about the same self? And AB, that's me. My thesis is that Hume thinks that we believe that we are continuing to think about the same self, but his problem is that he cannot account for this using causation and resemblance. So what was Hume's explanandum of personal identity? I contend that he was trying to explain a belief that he thinks that we all hold. I am one and the same continuing but changing thinker. He considers and rejects two possible explanations for how we could form this belief. It might be that there's an individual substance to which all my perceptions belong, which is the basis for my belief. Now, Hume famously rejects that we have any such idea of substance. There's no impression from which we could copy such an idea. We have no experience that can account for that, and the vulgar don't think about philosophical substance. We don't perceive real connections. So this is what every graduate student knows about Hume, perhaps every undergraduate student knows about Hume, that we do not have impressions of causation. And so there are no perceived real connections that could form the basis for believing in a continuing self. Instead, the explanation that Hume finds is that we only feel connections between our ideas of objects and perceptions. This impression of reflection conveys vivacity to the related idea such that it feels as if there's one continuous thought, and it feels as though the impression that introduces the vivacity is bound with the idea that it occasions. This feeling causes in us the mistaken thought that the object of the impression and the object of the idea are really bound together. And so we come to believe and attribute a real connection to objects of those ideas based upon this felt connection. And so it's a kind of error theory. So the interpretive puzzle is, in the appendix, Hume confesses a very defective explanation of the target belief. He writes, but having loosened all of our particular perceptions, when I proceed to explain the principle of connection, which binds them together and makes us attribute to them real simplicity and identity, I'm sensible that my account is very defective, right? And so notice the word feel. Which is not in that quotation. Pulled out of the hat. Okay, so to understand part of what's going on, I need to draw a distinction between primary ideas and secondary ideas. And the way that I illustrate this is using thought bubbles. So ideas are in clouds and impressions are in sunbursts, and the force and vivacity is conveyed through the color. So languid ideas are blue, they're kind of cold, whereas intense, forceful, lively, and vivacious impressions are orange. And so when I have an idea, it's just a single thought bubble. When I have an impression, it's just a single sunburst. So to form the idea, to form the target belief, to think about my thoughts, I need to form ideas of those perceptions, which Hume calls secondary ideas. And so the secondary idea is the vehicle of the belief. It's the second order thought about a perception. And so I've highlighted here, or I've dimmed the inside of the bigger bubble to call attention to the vehicle of the secondary impression, the mental object, if you will, although Lauren and Donald have come to some kind of peace accord where it's an activity. The content is the sunburst, which is what's represented in the secondary idea. So it refers to the impression of the mountain. So what I've called the present self problem, and I owe the name to Donald Baxter, is what I argued for in the Cambridge Companion to Hume's Treatise, which was edited by Donald Ainslie and myself. And it's this problem of using resemblance, causation, and operations of the imagination to produce belief that I am the same person, I am the same as the person who thought or did something past. So what's the problem? In order to represent the present moment as present, I would need a secondary idea of a present impression. But if I form an idea of this present impression, the idea exists now, and that impression is now past. And so what that shows is that Hume does not have the mental machinery to represent through a secondary idea a present impression. And so what that means is that it's impossible for him to form an idea of a present self understood as existing through time and including the present experience. So I cannot form the target belief that I now am the same person as she who did something or other. And so the conclusion that I drew in that article was that for Hume, all beliefs in one's own identity are retrospective. There are no present tense beliefs in extended selves. Now, Donald Baxter has raised an objection to Donald Ainslie's view. So Donald Ainslie's view was that Hume's problem that he confesses in the appendix is that in order to form the idea of oneself, one needs to rely upon higher order perceptions to do the work of bundling them together. And Donald Ainslie's question was, we have a Donald problem in Hume scholarship. Donald Ainslie's question was, how can Hume get those higher order bundling perceptions into the whole bundle? So Donald Baxter offers an inductive strategy as a response to Donald Ainslie's problem, which is, suppose that I am successful at forming a bunch of different beliefs. I can then develop a habit of attributing perceptions to myself. And so we can just swallow up in an inductive disposition any other beliefs, any other perceptions that I have, and attribute them to me as mine. And so the higher order perceptions get included into the bundle as mine. And so we can imagine it, Donald Baxter offering this objection to my present self problem by saying, well, if I form enough retrospective beliefs, I can develop a disposition of assigning perceptions to myself. And so when I encounter a present impression or a present idea, I can attribute that to myself on the basis of this habit. In response, I offer the updating problem. So this is the problem of the inability to use resemblance causation and operations of the imagination to combine the identity of a past self and its believer. So to set this up, let's consider a belief in self formed last Saturday. So day 7 here in the diagram. I couldn't do a sunburst, so I did a table, but the orange is to tell you that this is enlivened. It's a belief in the identity of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the content of this belief, let's call that Smith. And the vehicle of that belief is formed on day 7. And so that complex idea there, 1 through 6, is stitched together on day 6, and so on day 7, excuse me. And so on day 7, we have the thought, Smith continuously thinks from 1 to 6. Days are just, roll with me. I have more thoughts than one thought a day. It was just a convenient way to set up the problem. Now notice, because of the present self problem, we don't get to say, oh, and I'm sorry, the content of the thought there should be orange, right? Because it's a belief, it's enlivened, it's forceful and vivacious. So Smith continuously thinks from 1 to 6, yes.
Can you share your screen? For the people on Zoom?
Sorry about that, folks. No.
Wesley, can you make her co-host?
Yes.
Sorry for the interruption.
As long as I don't have to start over like Lauren did.
They won't get to see your starburst. That was the best part.
Does it come back? No.
You having trouble, Wesley?
Yeah. We do it
It's on my computer? Let me see.
Yeah, there you go.
Great, thank you.
It is.
Good.
So Donald Baxter, we could imagine asking of the present self problem, couldn't I have success forming a bunch of retrospective beliefs in self, develop a disposition or a habit in which anytime I have a perception that I attribute it to myself, and so we could solve the present self problem by a current impression or a current idea being attributed to myself by virtue of this inductive habit. And to that, I raise what I call the updating problem, which is that Hume's account of identity ascriptions based on resemblance, causation, and actions of the imagination cannot produce a later belief in the identity of both the self formed in a past belief and its believer. So there's no way to unite the believer with the object, the self that the believer believes in. So I'm setting up how this story is supposed to go. So last Friday, I had somebody had a belief of the identity of a self 1 through 6, and what they believed, the content of that belief was Smith continuously thinks from 1 to 6. That should be orange because it's enlivened and vivacious. So I apologize for misleading you with that. But my point is, the present self problem means that this believer cannot be attributed to, or that Smith cannot be identified with the believer because the believing at 7, the complex enlivened idea, is not part of that bundling. Right? The lesson of the present self problem was that all beliefs in personal identity on Hume's account are retrospective. Now, continuing, so let that simmer. Consider a week later, today. There are more perceptions. And today, day 14, there's a belief that's formed that unites 1 through 13 into a self, let's call it Kemp, of which a subset 1 through 6 we can call Smith. And the vehicle of this belief, Kemp, comes into formation on day 14. And so again, this should be orange. Kemp continuously thinks from 1 to 13. And so the question is, how do we get to the conclusion that the thinker about Smith's identity is Smith himself? So remember, the target belief, what I take Hume's project in 146 to be, is to explain how we have the belief in a same continuing but changing thinker. So using the belief formed at 14, Kemp, to update the original belief in Smith, we want to show that the believer at 7 was Smith himself. In other words, we want to show that Kemp is identical to Smith and that Kemp is identical to the believer at 7. And so there are 2 parts that I need to account for, and I think Hume thought he had an account that could do this. Right? Oops, sorry. So part A is identifying Smith with Smith, whereas the second Smith is a subset of Kemp, and part B is identifying the believer at 7 with Kemp. Now you might think, gosh, this is easy, Anne-Marie. This is the simplest problem you ever had that admits of a simple solution. You got some perceptions. Hume's a bundle theorist. Bring more perceptions into the bundle. Boom, you're done. There it is. The problem is there isn't a bundle. There are just so many perceptions now, including among them a belief about a bundle. But remember, there are no real connections. There is no substance that unites these things together. So now at 14, when I introspect, and for some reason I think I'm Kemp Smith, sorry about that. Now when I introspect, I find just so many impressions, I need something to bundle them together. And so the simple solution fails. Now Hume's account of resemblance might be able to provide us with a solution to A, where the content at day 7, which is what's inside the forceful and lively idea there, that's a belief, at 7, it resembles Smith with a Y, now at 14, which is a subset of Kemp. And so the resemblance there triggers the resemblance-based identity ascription, and I come to believe that Smith is Smith. Causation can get us the identity of the belief at 7, the vehicle, with all of those other perceptions 1 through 13. And so there's a causal relation, right? The bundling of 1 through 6 together produces the belief at 7, and maybe the belief at 7 causes me to do whatever I do at 8, 9, 10, and you are off, and you have a causal sequence, which Hume's account, again, of the identity ascribing principle will get you those things united together in a single self. And so boom, we're done. But notice, to satisfy this account of the updated target belief, we need to separately think about perception 7's content and vehicle. And remember, whoops, sorry, these are different things. Lauren did this in his presentation, so I feel justified in going back and forth, right? You see the difference? We got content, we got the vehicle, content, vehicle. Those are different thoughts about one and the same idea. One uses the primary idea, one uses the secondary idea. And so the first problem that Hume encounters is that this is psychologically taxing, right? You need to not only think about the content of the belief from day 7, but you also need to think about it as a mental action or a mental object, if you will, as the impression itself. And so this is psychologically taxing. What's more, whoops, I still want to do that. When tracing these two different relations of resemblance and causation, the question is, why should I think that the vehicle and the content are one and the same perception? Again, one more time, we get to look at this. Truth be told, the content doesn't occur at 7. The content occurs now at 14. It is, that arrow should go to 14. So it's part of the new perceptions that I am now recalling as I'm assembling a belief. And so the attribution of it back at time 7 is misleading. And so it's not actually, whoops, I keep doing backwards, sorry. It's not actually, these are two different perceptions. And so I need to somehow identify them, but that's yet another identity. So I need somehow to say that what is responsible for the content of my remembering Smith is the very thing that was the believing of Smith at 7. And the problem here is that those are two different things. So we'd expect that the identification of the believer in the self would be straightforward and immediate from the unified experience of believing at time 7. But on Hume's account, this is easier said than done. Because of the present self problem, the identification of the believer and the self that's believed in cannot be forged at the time of belief, but only retrospectively. At that later time, conceiving of the action of the mind, that is, believing in a continuant, employs a perception of a higher order than conceiving of its object, namely the continuant. These don't resemble. The one does not directly cause the other. If they're believed to exist in the same causal network, there must either be the lucky circumstance that the thinker discovers some common link in their causal sequences, or the thinker must painstakingly trace their common causal ancestry through ordinarily unnoticed psychological operations. On the first, where we're looking for some kind of lucky circumstance that identifies a common link, there's no guarantee of success that a common intermediary would be found. The second, where we do the painful work of the science of mind, requires extraordinary care and attention, not commonly found among the vulgar or most philosophers. And for the habit underlying Baxter's inductive strategy, if it's to take hold, we must do this again and again and again. These problems arise only because of limitations that Hume imposed on his own system. The unrenounceable principles that he has, that all perceptions are distinct existences, and the only perceivable connections are ideal. We don't perceive real connections. If perceptions inhered in a perceivable individual substance, present self problem would disappear, because it would be the self-same substance to which every perception belongs. If perceptions were not distinct existences and memory or belief were inseparable from the intentional objects, many of the distinct psychological operations in Hume's explanations would be unnecessary. If we could perceive real connections between distinct perceptions, the present self problem might arise initially because the vehicle of the belief in the self could not include the present perception, but later beliefs would discover the real connection between believing and the self, and the habit underlying Baxter's inductive strategy could be established. But Hume can't renounce those principles. Hume cannot explain how the vulgar ever form or update the target belief. Can't explain how philosophers ever form or update the target belief. Absent this vulgar target belief, there's no way to develop a habit of attributing new perceptions to the same self that would ground vulgar or philosophical beliefs in substance, self, or some other mysterious connecting principle. So Hume has failed to account for anyone's belief in personal identity. So to return to the plan of the talk, what I've shown so far, what I've taken myself to argue for so far, is that in 146, Hume's target is to explain how everybody believes that they are one and the same continuing person. The problem that he describes in the appendix is this updating problem, which builds off of what I call the present self problem, which is that I cannot now believe that I'm the same person as she who did whatever. The updating problem is I cannot later recover that believer in the idea of a new self. And so the problem that Hume encounters in the appendix is restricted to belief in personal identity. And so next is a lesson. Continuance. So belief that there are these continuing things, such as selves or objects or other minds, arises in thought. And Hume gives us an account of that in 142 that he draws upon in 146, that when we believe in a continuant, we take the idea of one thing and suppose that it participates in a succession. So we overlay a succession on a unity, and we take the unity to be divided along with the succession. And what I want to do is now turn to Lord Falkenstein on space and time. So Lorne tells us that for Hume, space and time are given as complex impressions, visual and tactile perception impressions. And so in 1, 2, 3, 4, that's an awesome number, Hume writes, if the eye is sensible of anything farther, so he's considering a purple table, and I always imagine it this lovely lilac color. If the eye is sensible of anything farther, I desire it may be pointed out to me. But it's impossible to show anything farther, we may conclude with certainty, that the idea of extension is nothing but a copy of these colored points and of the manner of their appearance. And so what Lorne takes from this is that extension is not just an aggregate or a combination of simple impressions. Extension itself is a complex impression. And you might say, but I was taught Hume is a psychological atomist. Where does he say that extension is a complex impression? Right there. He says it's a copy of these colored points and the manner of their appearance, right? So people have this tendency to think that the manner, so people like some of these 19th century objectors are, well, where's the appearance? Where's the manner of their appearance? What impression do we have of the manner? No, it's a complex. It is a feature of the given that it has this manner, and that cannot be reduced to these other components, parts, namely the points. Same story for time. Regrettably, I have to change this to 4 notes, but Lorne does too, because he has it as Beethoven's 9th, the first 4 notes. So 5 notes played on a flute give us the impression of, and idea of time, though time itself not be a 6th impression, which presents itself to the hearing, or any of the other senses. The idea of some objects it must certainly have, nor is it possible for it without these ideas ever to arrive at conception of time, which, since it appears not as any primary distinct impression, can plainly be nothing but the different ideas or impressions, or objects disposed in a certain manner, that is, succeeding each other. So again, time, succession, is not a combination of simple impressions. Time itself is a complex impression that's grasped. And so Falkenstein calls this intuitionism, and he cautions us to handle that word carefully. As a reformed Kant scholar, Lorne treads carefully with these terms of art that Kant creates again and again and again. That's one of your chief complaints about Kant, is he's an inventor of terms of art. So according to Lorne, Hume's account of the origins of our ideas of space and time might be best described as intuitionist, where intuition is taken to refer to immediate apprehension, that is, we directly grasp contiguity and distance relations. According to this account, visual and tactile impressions are divisible into simple parts that are disposed outside of one another over space prior to any association or combination and prior to any judgment. Spatial experience is not the product of acts of imagination or understanding. Simple visual and impressions are already given as disposed in space in our original and its most primitive sensory experience. So notice, on Falkenstein's, on Hume's intuition according to Falkenstein, there we go, the title is correct. We're not given continuance. We're not given continuance. That was my lesson. They're constructed in thought. For Lorne, we're given particular extensions and successions, but these distinct extensions and successions are not guaranteed to be continuous with each other. And so this is the point that I want to push on. Right, so when I have sensory experiences, I have sensory experiences of particular expanses and particular successions. And for Hume, remember too, that these are distinct modes of appearance. And so combining time and space together into space-time is an additional action or a connection that needs to be done. But my point here is that if you just restrict ourselves to space, or if we just restrict ourselves to time, what experience presents us with are different expanses or different successions. And so we need to somehow stitch those together to get space and duration themselves. And so Hume would need some metaphysical principle to connect these discontinuous spaces together into a single space and time. So on offer, one of the principles that people like Locke appeal to is that the parts of space, and Kant, the parts of space or duration are immovable and inseparable from each other. So let's look at Locke. So Locke's project in book 2 of Ideas is to account for the source of all of our ideas and experience, right? Namely sensation and reflection. So in book 1, he's rejected the nativism of Descartes and others. He thinks there are no innate ideas, that everything that is an object of thought begins in experience. And so it's a long book, and in the middle, he offers us accounts of space and time, space and duration. And he holds that we have simple ideas of extension and simple ideas of time. So experience presents me with particular expanses or particular successions, right? So notice this initially given expanse is undifferentiated. The succession is undifferentiated. It's bound together. It's unified. What I can do as an operation of the mind is think about it and make a new complex idea. So anytime the mind operates on an idea, it introduces complexity for Locke. So simple ideas are passively received through the senses or through reflection. And then as the mind makes distinctions, as the mind compares and makes bigger ideas or abstracts away, we get complex ideas. So one of the first operations of the mind on these expanses or successions might be to differentiate parts, right? And this is the operation that Locke calls discerning. And so I've divided the expanse into 5 parts. I've divided the succession into 4 parts. Then I can repeat and compound them and decompound them in thought. Decompound, by the way, just means to repeat again. And I can abstract from them to form an idea of a single spatial part. And I continue to repeat without limit, so the music goes on. And so notice that this allows me to form an idea of more and more and more spatial parts, more and more temporal parts. And this is the experientially informed idea of infinity, of continuing to add without limit. And so the question is, this idea of infinity of space, this idea of infinity of time, are they real? And Locke says, yes, they are. We can know that they're real. Why? Any part of space or duration is inseparable from any other part. They're immovable and they're inseparable. You cannot prescind a part of space from the rest of space. There is no limit to the number of parts of space or duration. Passively received ideas of extension or succession are real. Every simple idea that we receive through the senses is guaranteed to be real. And those passively received simple ideas put us in contact with one and the same space or duration, which is infinite. Hume can come along and ask, well, show me your empiricist credit, right? Give me the reason for thinking that parts of space are inseparable from other parts. Lauren himself says in the book that he's referring to as Hume's Remedy, that Hume's own divisibility of ideas introduces this kind of question, and I'm pushing you on this, which is that we can separate and divide ideas into their component parts and think of them as existing one apart from another. And so I want to know, why should we think that parts of space are inseparable from other parts? And it needs to be strong enough that we can get the unity of all of space and the unity of all of time. I don't think Hume has that. So remember, my lesson in part 3 was we aren't given continuants. These are constructed in thought. Instead, what we're given are particular extensions and successions. So I'm granting that to Lauren. But experience does not guarantee that the particular expanses or the particular successions that we're given are continuous with each other. We fall asleep, we blink. There are all kinds of interruptions in our perceptual experience that creates discontinuities. So what's the answer for Hume? The answer is objects. We need continuous objects to connect these particular extensions and successions to each other. And this accords with how Hume structures part 2 of book 1 of the treatise, right? So scholars neglect to talk about why Hume has been in the first 5 sections talking about space and time and the ideas and impressions of space and time themselves. And then in book 6, he's talking about existence and external existence. And the reason is, for Hume, space and time themselves depend upon the existence of objects. If there were no objects, there would be no space, there would be no time. Now, remember my lesson that I called out in part 3. The idea of identity involves supposing that a unity participates in a succession of things. That is, continuants exist and are created in thought. And so the lesson to be learned, putting together what I've shown you and what Lauren has said, is that space and time themselves are constructed. So the entirety of space in itself and the entirety of time in itself are constructed through our ideas of objects. And so this was brought to you by the Hume Depot.
All right, thank you for that, Anne-Marie. Lauren, is it okay if we field questions that can be addressed to you as well as Anne-Marie during this session? So combine the crowd questions. Okay, so please feel free to direct your questions at Lauren or Anne-Marie. I will keep a list of questioners. So please raise your hand and I'll get you on the list. Lauren, why don't you start off?
Just on your last point, Anne-Marie, are there any limits to the construction?
What kinds of limits are you imagining?
Well, are we having to take individual simple colored points and put them together to construct space, or do we at least get visual fields and
I'm granting you that we get visual. So Lauren's question, he didn't put the microphone on. So for those of you who are on Zoom, his question was, what are the limits to the construction that's involved here in the construction of space and time? So for example, do we have to construct spatial expanses from simple impressions in experience? And I'm granting to you that there are complex given impressions. It seems right to me to say that, so one of the things that you get when you compare Locke and Hume on space and time is a fundamental disagreement about what a simple idea is, right? Or what simplicity is. So for Locke, simple ideas are not partless. They are not indivisible in that sense. And so you can have an extended simple of extension or succession because what's simple about it is the homogeneity of consecutiveness or the homogeneity of succession. And so Locke thinks that when I have a visual or tactile experience, I get, in addition to color or in addition to texture, I get an idea of extension. And if it's a bodily thing, an idea of expansion, an idea of unity, right? An idea of existence. So there are a whole host of ideas that are all simple that come coupled together in that experience. For Hume, simplicity is not defined that way, right? Simplicity is defined as partlessness. And so simple ideas are indivisible. And so for space and time, the simples are going to be points. For time, it's going to be moments. And so I'm inclined to agree with you and to agree with Kant that it doesn't make sense to try to build up spatial and temporal relations in terms of just these simple points themselves. That where would the adjacency come from? Where would the seriality come from, the direction? None of that can be accounted for just in terms of the component parts themselves. But my point is, notice that Hume and Locke start from the same experiential starting point, that we're given these particular expanses, that we're given these particular durations. My point is that comes chopped up in experience. And so the synthesis of the manifold of space and time themselves cannot happen for Hume a priori. He can't be Kant. And so it has to happen experientially. And the question is, what's going to do the work? And my answer is objects.
Great, thanks. So Rob Staten, you're next. Oh, and I'd like to add anyone on Zoom. You feel free to post in chat or raise your hand, and we will get you a chance to speak. Rob?
Thanks very much, Anne-Marie. I hope you'll forgive me. I had a question that I've been dying to ask Lauren. So when I was reading the introduction to the book, Lauren, and as I continued to read through it, I was really struck by your methodology, and I just wanted to ask you to say more about it. And so as a kind of preamble here, there's, as a caricature, there's two extreme views about how to do history of philosophy, right? So one is contextualism. You want to know, what did the person really think? You're looking at their letters, you're looking at who they're reading, you're looking at their background science. And the other extreme would be, we think that there are perennial philosophical problems and we want to make use of texts from history to help us solve those problems, and then we try and improve the arguments as best we can from our contemporary point of view to make progress. And you don't go in for either of those extremes, in the sense that you want to reconstruct Hume, but you only want to make use of tools that he would have had at his disposal. So I wanted to just ask you to say some more about why you pick that middle ground, and tell me more about how that middle ground looks.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And yeah, you're right. One of the things I was doing in this book was to try to exemplify a somewhat different approach to the history of philosophy. And I see the work as historical, without qualification. I think that we can take ideas, historical ideas, as well as historical thinkers as objects. And particularly in the case of someone like Hume, who declared that he would not reply to his critics, and who decided to disown his anonymous work, and instructed people only to gain his, and yet had lots of contemporary critics. I think it is an interesting historical question. What could he have said? And I have perhaps foolishly attempted, you know, some people would say, oh, you can't divorce yourself from your time, and you can't avoid being anachronistic, and either you abide by the letter of the text or you're being anachronistic. And I've perhaps foolishly attempted to, so far as possible, avoid understanding Hume in the light of contemporary work and avoid the temptation to show how Hume's work might be relevant, because the minute you give into that temptation, anachronism becomes inevitable. So my enterprise has just been to say, just try and think yourself back into the 18th century. Put yourself in Hume's shoes and see what you can come up with by way of response to Reid or only slightly later Kantian inspired objections. So that's the project. Whether I've done it successfully or not, I guess, is open to debate. But I see it as a rigorously historical project of a different sort.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Johnny, you're next.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. I'm just trying to figure out what the source of the problem that you see Hume facing in the appendix is. Would the problem go away if a perception could represent itself? So if a perception could be part of its own content?
I suspect that it would. Some people try to, so Annette Beyer says things in some of her work that suggests that what's changed between the treatise and the inquiry is the nature of impressions, right? And impressions standing in causal relations. And so his story of causation no longer, let's see, I'm messing up the details here. But yeah, if impressions were somehow self-representing, then you could, when you have an impression, it could itself be both the vehicle and the content. But the way that Hume describes secondary perceptions leads me to think that he always thinks of them as having this copying relation. And so the content cannot be itself the vehicle at the same time, that there's this one function per perception.
Yeah, and I read Hume in the same way that you do on that point. Of course, it wouldn't be enough, I take it, it wouldn't be enough if a perception could be the whole of its own content. There would have to be a perception whose content includes both that very perception itself and the past perceptions with which
and so there's
unified.
And so some people want to point to the activity of the mind as being part of the problem too, right? That how does that get stuffed into the content of this thought, and what on earth is activity? So you can talk about impressions being suffused with consciousness or something like that, but Hume seems to have a much more robust conception of what activity of the mind is that sure as heck looks like cheating.
But now I'm starting to worry, and this, I should say, insofar as there's an objection here, it applies to my own work on this topic as well as yours. So, hey, we're both in this together. Now I'm wondering whether the problem is really limited to personal identity in the way that I think you want to say. Because if the root of the problem is Hume's view that a perception can't have itself as part of its own content, isn't what we're seeing here really a problem for Hume's whole theory of mental representation, not just for the account of personal identity?
I think it is the self-referencing aspect of reflexive beliefs about oneself that's doing the problem, and these so-called third personal ideas of other people's minds, so staring into the breast of somebody else or into mountains and houses and trees and tables, aren't a problem because the idea of identity is complex. And so what's giving you the idea of the content of the continuant is the impression, but what's giving you the idea of its duration is something else. And then there's the bundling it all into a complex idea, and there isn't any kind of reflexivity involved in that. So there's a process. And so I think Hume does require a step between the present impression of, so, I mean, yeah, that you're, the bundling activity, if we can call it that, of object beliefs is an additional thing beyond the sensing. But I think for Hume, I see. I think for Hume, what he'd want to say is that, yeah, that's nice. Because I want to say that the present impression gets retained. No, maybe that's right, that all of our beliefs about identity are retrospective. And the difference in the solution, so we can help ourselves to Baxter's solution of inductive beliefs about past objects, can't we? And so any sensory impression that I encounter, I can have a disposition to assign identity to it. And so I can help myself to that habit. And then this current impression that I have as of a microphone, I can attribute identity to that. And because it doesn't have that reflexive, I don't run into the same kind of problem as I do with persons. What do you think?
Lauren, did you want to jump in here and follow up?
Well, this sort of is a follow-up to that issue. It just makes me think about what your position is on the role of presentism in Hume's theory of temporal experience. So, are you thinking that perceptual consciousness is confined to the present moment and anything prior to the present is not perceptual consciousness? It is somewhat.
Well, even if I allow for extended presence, right, it still has parts, right? And so I think even on your account, a continuing object would be composed, so just continuing object would be composed of momentary parts, right, that are grasped at once in a succession, so a complex sensory experience of a table. And so it still seems to me that the question is, why should I think of this succession that I'm given? So a complex impression of time. Why should I think that that is an experience of one object? And that's what Hume's psychological account needs to supply, because I can have successive experiences that are not of a single object, right? So as multiple things happen all at the same time, I still have a successive experience. And so the question is, how do I narrow in on the thing that is one continuing object? And that's not given an experience that's constructed for Hume.
I think you're right that it's constructed. But I'm not sure about the break between the very present self and the earlier parts. So let me talk about space, talk about a momentary perception of the table.
Mm-hmm.
When I have my momentary perception of the table, I'm going to step back from it so that I'm not just seeing the tabletop. I am seeing a purple rectangle. Now, I think that's constructed, and that it is a construct that is due to association, a kind of association Hume didn't recognize. Hume only talked about association of ideas or impressions and ideas, but I think there are also, in this case, association of the impressions themselves, the parts of the table are all resembling out to a certain boundary where there is an edge and a sharp quality difference. And so you can imagine a kind of construction that says, start at one point and then take the immediate surrounding neighborhood, and are those points exactly resembling and proximate? Keep going, keep going, keep going wider, wider, wider. So you're stepping out on the basis of resemblance and proximity until you reach an edge. There you stop, and that construct gives you your rectangular tabletop. So that's a line of how you get from an entire visual field that is just populated by colored points to a visual field that is populated by color patches that have different shapes. There's constructive operation that yields it. But I start from the center point, and the center point does not disappear. I just go out, 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 out. So why wouldn't it happen in time in the same way? If you're granting that my temporal consciousness is not confined, that perceptual consciousness is not confined to the present moment, but extends a little way back into the past, why can't I start from the present moment and then go back, back, back? And as long as I don't find a break, I think I am seeing the same thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to say. Yeah, I mean, Hume is funny about complexity, right? So if we take seriously your claim that spatial and temporal experience is complex and given as a complex, and what you're given as a visual or a tactile field, notice that this work that you're talking about us doing is a lot of the operations of the mind that Locke talks about, right? And so it's after the experience, and it's a kind of reconstruction of what the heck was I experiencing? And so notice that if you even get that, so if we do that work, we still are running into my problem of that's all retrospective, right? So for Locke, it would be you have now generated a new idea, and we have this question now of why should I think that these modes that I've created refer to the same thing, real thing that this object was. And for Hume, I wonder what the resources are to take that kind of work that I've done now to identify this piece and to make claims about it. What is it that I can appeal to the prior experience as being complex, but I guess I'm just not seeing the kind of guarantee that we've gotten, that we've retained the original givenness, that we haven't created something new that now needs to be identified with what we experienced before.
Thank you for that. Donald?
Okay, I've got a textual question for Anne-Marie about Hume and a textual question for Anne-Marie about Lorne, and then a kind of a philosophical question for both of you, if that's not too much. So the technical question about Hume is about your problem with the present self and what you make of paragraph 13815. So this is a place where Hume is talking about how its official view of causation is that every causal belief has to have its source in an impression. He believes that impressions cause ideas. And so here I have an idea of something. So now I'm introspectively observing. I have an idea of, I don't know, what a papaya tastes like, but I can then infer that I tasted a papaya previously. And so he says, well, how do I infer an impression from an idea? I said, you had to start from an impression to get a causal inference or causal belief. And he says, well, in this case, because you're reflecting on your mind, the perceptions you're observing, presumably through secondary ideas, are kind of taking the place of impressions. And he says, this idea here, the idea of the taste of papaya, is not here considered as the representation of any absent object, but as a real perception of the mind, of which we're intimately conscious. One of the few times he uses conscious. It must be able to bestow on it whatever is related to it, the same quality, firmness, solidity, force, vivacity, with which the mind reflects upon it and is assured of its present existence. So he seems to be saying, when I observe the mind, I'm assured of the present existence of the perceptions I'm thereby thinking about. And so I guess that suggests that maybe the present self problem isn't quite as dire as you were suggesting.
There's a possible ambiguity there, sure, right? I think of the present impression under consideration here. So it's one.
Yeah, it's an idea, but yeah.
So present here might not mean existing now. It may mean the one that so it might be an indexical picking out or demonstrating this. So that's a possibility. Another concern that I have is still the point of the updating problem is that we need to somehow get the vulgar to, and I know you dispute whether the vulgar have beliefs about selves, but we need to get everybody on board identifying secondary impressions with their primary impressions. And that's where I thought you were headed with 13815, was to talk about how you have this causal connection between that licenses the inference from where did I get this idea from? Oh, hey, there used to be this impression previously. And the point that I would want to make in reasserting the updating problem is that we need the causal relation to be such that it licenses the identification of one and the same experience, not simply that this impression caused this idea or this process caused this belief, but instead that they were one and the same experience. And it's not clear to me how Hume is supposed to be able to do that. But yeah, so if we could, the present idea, I can infer it's, so I think when you have causal beliefs, so I had said in the abstract that I was going to confirm Lauren's story about complexes being given. I actually think causal beliefs are complex experiences, that the cause comes related to the effect. And so when you have a belief about causation or a causal relation between two relata, both of them are in the belief. And so part of what I was doing over the summer was I was trying to disentangle Hume's account of belief. So he talks about belief may most properly be defined as a lively idea related to a present impression, And so I think the complex is the point of reference. And so when I believe of the present impression that it is caused by, the present idea that it is caused by an antecedent impression, that it's a new token belief. And there's a brand new idea that comes into this complex that I say is that previous idea, but it's not as though the idea gets held over.
Sure. Yeah, I think that might work. Just to clarify, it's not that I don't think the vulgar have beliefs about the self. I don't think the vulgar have beliefs about their minds as bundles of perceptions. That's something that only a philosopher who's entered most intimately into themselves would have a belief about. And so, the vulgar have all sorts of beliefs about themselves.
You've said that you think that the problems or the account that he gives in 146 is...
It's an account of the philosophical notion of the mind as a bundle of perceptions,
which
isn't a vulgar.
That's what I'm disputing. I think it's an account of belief in a self, where the self might be a bundle of perceptions, it might be a substance, it might be a mysterious, who knows what, a la Shaftesbury, that the vulgar enjoy. And Hume's story is universal in its application, and then these bells and whistles that get added on by philosophers or others are additional, and you can find the stories of where they come from in 143 of the ancient philosophy when he talks about how do we get the idea of substance from variation and continuity.
Okay, my question my textual question about Lorne is you say on your handout and in the slide of the last page, you say Falkenstein, and it's not a quotation, it's just I think you're taking Lorne to hold this. Extension is a complex impression. Time is a complex impression. I'm going to focus on extension. I didn't think extension is a complex impression. I thought the impression of extension is complex. But extension is the manner in which objects are disposed. So it's the question of, I guess, how idealist is your Hume? Are space and time themselves perceptions? I don't think that's the case for Hume.
Yeah, I know truth be told, my Hume is idealist. So I cringe when people start talking about bodies. Because I think Hume is skeptical about that. And so I think what he thinks we can retain from our philosophizing is the idealist part, and the rest is just wishful thinking that we're disposed to. And he has these explanations of why we're disposed to think these, but he thinks that at bottom, so the pipes and canals and all those physical explanations that he appeals to, I want to translate back into idealistic speak if we're going to do a proper science of the human mind. And so I look to footnotes like the stuff about the vacuum where he thinks, if I were a betting man, I would go with the scientists and deny a vacuum, or I would or go with Newton's account on the vacuum, or, if I were a betting man, I'd go with the contemporary physiology. But I think that's a wager. I don't think that's scientifically rigorously defensible on the science of man.
Lauren, do you think extension is a complex impression?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
So this is a residual disagreement that we have. I'm not comfortable with content vehicle distinction. Even though I'm saying there's no thing that perceives the perception, I don't want to. I don't see in Hume that there is anything more than a story of the nature of perceptions. Visual and tactile perceptions are extended. The complex ones are extended. They aren't of extension. So I'm digging in my heels on that one. And if it means we have bodies, and if it means that perceptions, because they're extended and because they resist deformation when we see them bump into one another, that therefore they're solid and therefore they're material.
But I heard you saying that impressions are extended there, which I agree with you on that. What exactly that means, I think we might disagree on, but that seems to me that's different from saying extension is a complex impression. So one is a claim about what extension is, and one is a claim about what features impressions have.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Yeah, extension is more than a complex impression. We've got ideas. But ideas of colors and tactile qualities are themselves disposed in space. We have ideas of what is occluded by certain objects, lies behind them, ideas of what is beyond the bounds of the sensory field. So we are constantly thinking about an extension beyond the impressions that's containing other information.
Okay, that's helpful. And then my final question for you both in a way is thinking about the relation of like objects, because I still want to think of extension as being the manner in which objects exist spatially, that's to say, side by side and so on. And then Hume gives a complex story about how we come to conceive of objects as things that have continued a distinct existence. And I've always thought in the end, he's going to need to go developmental and start us as infants having the blooming, buzzing confusion, going back to James. And like we slowly come to conceive of the world as having objects spatially disposed. And that's a social process in part, as we're taught by our parents how to sort of carve up things. It's also a very natural process. Human beings are such that, given our physical and physiological needs, we parcel out things a certain way. And some combination of that allows us to come up with a mature world of objects disposed spatially thus and so. Whether the world conforms to the way we happen to think, that's the skeptical question. And I think Hume thinks it ultimately can't be answered. It's a valid question. Philosophy is impotent when it comes to trying to address it. But I'm wondering, do either of you think there's a place for that kind of developmental story in Hume? And if there is, why didn't he give it?
Oh, but he did. And so, Lauren has a lovely article that doesn't get referenced enough. I reference it in News, which is Hume's reply to Kant. And in it, he has this interlude called Exact Scrutiny, where the question is, how is it that we distinguish spurious causal relations from genuine causal relations? And it involves so Lauren finds this passage where Hume talks about exact scrutiny, and it's these crucial experiments that help us to make these kinds of distinctions. And so the answer to the question, where did Hume offer this developmental story, is in 1 through 15, the rules by which to judge of causes and effects. And so the story is that, and the stuff in 1 through 13, where he talks about different kinds of generalizations that we make that are too quick, and the corrective ways that we can replace those generalizations with new habits of mind, or replace them with equally bad inferences if we're not careful. But the point is that I do think that Lauren is right in a handful of his papers where he talks about probable belief and stories about how we can correct, how philosophy can be a corrective to, or make things worse even, to probable judgments that we form. And so I do see those developmental components in it. He doesn't start from infancy, but that would be tedious.
Thanks, Anne Marie. I agree with all of that. I also take some consolation from the fact that other people were doing this sort of thing, particularly Condillac. We've got no reason to think that there was ever any interaction between Hume and Condillac, but you can at least look at the Traité des Sensations and see a real developmental story that leads up to recognition of objects, and think if Condillac is writing this in 1754 or 1756, it is at least the sort of thing that Hume could have thought. And maybe it's because he gave up on the treatise and and just decided not to do those sorts of explanations anymore. But he, as you point out, he did do a bit of it.
Great, thank you, everybody. We do have time for another question or two, if people would like to ask. Johnny?
Sorry to sound so obsessional, but just again on the source of the problem that you're raising for Hume, or that Hume is raising in the appendix. I'm actually wondering whether the distinction between the present and the past is actually not essential to the problem. Isn't the really important thing that no perception represents itself? So even two simultaneous perceptions, because neither of them can represent itself, neither of them can represent the whole composed by both of them.
Yeah, and so an idea, well, and so that's going to fall strayed away from Hume's characterization of complexity or complex ideas, right? That the complex is composed of these parts, and so he might think that this follows as a straightaway consequence of how he distinguished between simple and complex, or relatively simple compared to complex, that complex is composed of the parts. And so, yeah.
I was thinking of it as, because that leaves open the possibility that the complex represents itself, I would think. But I was thinking Hume could just get to it this way. Representation involves copying. Copying involves causation, and
causation requires distinct relation.
Causation involves distinctness. A cause is distinct from its effect.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, Hume himself also holds that causes precede their effects. Right. So for him, there's a temporal dimension built into causation. But you could dispense with that part of his view and still generate the kind of problem that you're raising. Yeah. What's important is the distinctness, not the successiveness, I would think.
Yeah, that's nice. And so it's a problem with complex cell, right? It just complex things being regarded as identical, or this tension between ever getting from, I like that, thank you.
Great, thanks. So I have a question online from Alexander Klein, and then Lauren wants to jump in. Alex, you can unmute yourself. And
yeah, thanks. So I have a question for Lauren, maybe an invitation to say a little more about something we haven't talked so much about. I'm interested in this idea that impressions are complex, but in some sense the sort of whole is prior to the parts. You cite this word that Hume uses. It's from 12419, where he says that the points, I guess, in the visual field are confounded. And I was just trying to wrap my head around what is the sense in which the visual field is actually composed of points if they're confounded. Like, is it a kind of, well, there's a sort of impression, a complex impression is like a bowl of jelly, and it's as though the jelly is composed of points, but it's not real. Like, what's this relationship between the points and the whole I'm struggling with? Can you say more?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think in that passage, he's concerned with issues of measurement. And the point there is that even though he thinks that space is finitely divisible, and therefore is a matter of fact composed of points, that attempting to determine the sizes of visual objects by counting up number of points along a line is not practical. That's his point. It's like a computer screen. It is in fact pixelated, but if you want to try and count up how many pixels, the claim is that they are too small and too closely packed to be able to do that. That doesn't mean they're not discrete. It's still pixelated. It's just that it is usually very hard, but he is also invested in saying that there are occasions when we can do it. So there's also a passage where he is trying to argue for the absurdity of infinite divisibility. And he says, take one of these smallest possible points. So what you're supposed to do is put an ink spot upon paper, retreat until just before it disappears, and then you've got a smallest possible visible point. And then you want to put one of them beside another. And he is committed to the possibility of this experiment, but he says, you've got to make them of different colors to prevent their coalition and confusion. And then he declares, surely a red and a blue point may lie immediately contiguous to one another without either leaving a gap or annihilation or penetration. So that this is like empirical verification that space is discrete. It's just composed of, and then he says, and surely I can verify that if I then add a second and a third point, it increases in size in proportion to the number of points. And if I added infinitely many, it would be infinitely large. So no finite extension can. It's for that purpose that he's making it. I don't think he's at all giving up on discreteness of space and the granular or pixelated constitution of visual and tactile experience.
Great, thanks. And Lauren, you get the last question or comment.
I'll get the last. I have to rain on Johnny's and Marie. What do you mean by representation in Hume? I will answer. I will take it. Well, Don Garrett's answer that it's either resemblance or it's nothing. But Hume writes that himself. How can an impression represent an idea otherwise than by resembling it? From which it would follow that they must represent themselves. That's what representation is. What resembles itself more perfectly than self? It's not even different in time or space. There's no difference whatsoever. So it's absolutely perfect resemblance.
I think that resemblance is necessary but not sufficient for representation. Representation is copying, and copying is causation plus resemblance. My switch off, not a strategist.
I'm not so sure.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. And let's thank our speakers, please. For Anne-Marie. Thank you. Enjoy it and good health. And think of Lauren when you drink your more. Thanks everyone for coming today. It's been a long afternoon and we worked very hard. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to the grad club for a drink or two. And then we have dinner at 7 o'clock downtown. For those of you that didn't sign up for dinner, I had some cancellations and I have spots. I've already paid for the food and it's been prepared. Please come and eat the food. It's going to be good food. If you can make it, you're welcome to follow us to the grad club or meet us at 630 East Dundas at 7 o'clock. Come crash the party and you're welcome to join in. So thanks everyone. Yeah, I got room for 2 more and more than that. So I think everyone here could be welcome.
Students, it's free food.
Free food, it's paid for. So please come. Thanks everybody. I just gotta tidy up and shut some things down. So I'll need a few minutes, but we can.
And one more round for Lauren's writing the schedule.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for coming and visiting and traveling so far.